Very slowly right you. So that we have an annual event. Okay, great. I'm Karin Kettenring. I've met almost everybody here. I maybe know everybody. And Chad and Keith and I have been having this meeting for quite a few years. We've been hosting it here at USU. And it's just an opportunity for the students to present on the research and what is relevant to management and restoration, and for us to hear from you all about what you've been up to this year. And I encourage my students to try to introduce themselves to folks they don't know. So if you are at an agency and you have a student coming up to you, please be friendly. And some of these folks are also looking for jobs too. So if you are presenting as the head of your organization and you know you have positions coming up, I actually would encourage you to just mention what's on the horizon, because I think that would actually be very helpful. This is one way for you to get connected with people that might have skill sets that you are looking for. And in terms of introducing folks, when the representative of the organization is up here, why don't we just, people can introduce their people at that time. So when Keith goes here, he'll introduce Forestry Fire State Lands people. Chad, you can do your DWR people and so forth.
I don't know.
And if you don't know, we're in trouble. Get a name tag if you haven't already. And then the reason we have that sign-in sheet is for auditing reasons. Key people we have to show what's here benefited from this money. So we do not have microphones. So when you speak loudly.
Yeah. This is the microphone that will hear you. So pretend you're like talking at them.
We have a couple people on Zoom, but two of my students that live elsewhere. But other than that, that's, yeah, so we just want to make sure they can be heard. Is there anything else people need to know, Sam?
No, just project loudly. We do not have a microphone.
Okay, so we've got Keith Hambrick up first. And Keith, if you don't mind introducing your Forestry Fire State Lands folks before you dive in.
Yes.
Great.
So my name is Keith Hambrecht. I am the Restoration Program Manager for State Lands, for Forestry Fire State Lands. And then here in the room, we have Callan and Arlo, our restoration coordinators on Great Salt Lake. Online is Jens Amon. He is our Jordan River Restoration Coordinator. He's going to come today. He's feeling sick, so you spreading what you have, and sorry you couldn't make it. So he's on the Jordan River. And then we have Ray Robinson, who's well speak as well. He is our restoration coordinator for Bear River. And I'm going to present on Great Salt Lake, Jordan River, and Utah Lake. We manage the beds of those water bodies, as well as Bear Lake, Bear River, and sections of the Green Colorado River. And we have Utah Lake and that's open now, and we have another new position that's for so the other thing that this meeting kind of serves as
Not on.
The other thing that this meeting serves as for those of us at DMR is we typically host kind of a end of season meeting to just so that we can see all the work that we've done over the years. So some of it might just be, might lack a little bit of context. We're trying to share with the other DA people what we have problems this year, so what's going on there.
Can you talk just a little bit louder?
I will do my best. Yes. Okay, so I just went I put it together chronologically for each water body. So starting on Great Salt Lake, got a little bit more detail for Great Salt Lake, and I'll cover Utah Lake and Jordan River. But this is basically last winter, the beginning of our season, mowing and trampling for the year. This map shows our mowing in green and trampling in orange, and we got 6,400 acres done. That was the largest acreage we've done yet for mowing and trampling. And we also still were not able to get all of our work accomplished. That's a theme now. We've been requesting so much work out of our contractors that typically it doesn't all get completed.
That's better with the color.
Yeah.
They all put everybody to sleep. Okay.
Yeah, it's all right. And then this we typically try to finish in the spring, mowing and trampling, and as well we had mowing happening in places in August. Not ideal, not what we hoped for, but we also know we have all this work that we need to get done. So, we did attempt some prescribed fire in the spring, and we had our Ogden Bay Pintail Flats. We planned that, but did not get completed. And then in Bear River Bay, we did some burning, but it was a bit wet and not very successful. Then in the late spring, we had our big seeding effort, and we did disking and seeding at 3 locations at Howard Slough, Central Davis Sewer District, Outfall, and Farmington Bay outside of Teal Lake. We got almost 100 acres seeded this year, which is by far the largest. The bottom left there is Howard Slough. So we just got 2 patches done on that outflow that comes out of Bayview Duck Club. And then the bigger map is Farmington Bay. We did the channel that is the Central Davis Sewer District outflow. A bunch of stuff around the airboat channel outside of Teal Lake. And then we even did a little bit along the little channel outside of Chirpin Unit as well. We did 50% stratified saltgrass, 50% dormant saltgrass, and we also had bulrushes that we put in there and saltgrass, and let's see. So I think all that looks pretty good. We saw a lot of it germinate. But then while we were out there, I just had observations from around the wetlands for Green's work, and then also our seeding from last year. So this upper right is last year's seeding at Farmington Bay. We did about 40 or 50 acres. And it was really successful, and I think most of that saltgrass established. And then the bottom left is we were seeding outside of Teal Lake, and that's all 3 square bulrush that came back. It might have been from actually Karuna's project. We put 3 square out there, a lot of it, or it's passive. And then the bottom right is outside of Howard Slough. On the east side of our project outside of Howard Slough, we saw hundreds of acres of 3 square come back. That was exciting. We did grazing again this summer. Similar areas were done in the past, big plot outside of Farmington Bay, and then a smaller acres outside of Howard Slough. And then for our spraying this year, we sprayed 9,100 acres. And then we also got some help from Nature Conservancy, and they got almost 700 acres on solid land. And this is a little bit less than we sprayed last year. Last year we sprayed for 11,000 acres. But we were limited by drought conditions this year. So things were kind of amazingly dry for a pretty average water year. The wetlands dried out really quickly. We do have a couple of new areas that we sprayed. We sprayed outside of Unit 3 at Ogden Bay, which is this piece here. So that's a new block that we flooded up and sprayed for the first time. And then this Miller Pond, which is renewal mentioned, but we're getting a dike rebuilt there. And we had all sprayed for the first time. And then we actually got into some ground spraying this year. We mostly have not been using ground spraying because we have such large acreages and haven't reached a point in a lot of these project areas where we need careful spot spraying. So I think that was another sign of progress. Had areas where we really want to. I wanted to mention this group that Colton and Talon did. We have this new slick sled trailer that we pull behind the Marshmaster. That photo is the slick sled, and then it has the dump bed on it. And basically just drag it through the wetlands. It's really exciting to get equipment like this. I think it's going to be really helpful for planting. And then also a new-ish piece of equipment is a backhoe attachment that we have in the back of the Marshmaster. And they experimented with taking this backhoe attachment and pulling up full rushes, putting it on this sled, pulling it to the location and transplanting them. And really the effort was to just kind of test out the equipment. They did it in July, but we had really low expectations of success, but actually it seemed like these transplants actually survive. So you can transplant bulrushes in July. And then this fall we did a prescribed fire in Bear River Bay, and typically we don't really have the time to accomplish burning in the fall right before the hunt. And still a little bit of fire season, fire resources for come by. But we were able to pull this off. And this was just really, really good timing. Much of this area had been sprayed. It was bone dry when we went out to burn. So the burn was super successful. We got over 2,000 acres burned. And this photo just shows how successful it was. That right side of the dike. It's just burned to a crisp. We got basically everything consumed. And then this map shows the area that we burned in red, and you can see it's not an easy patch of fragmites to burn. It's not an easy patch to match, so it was well worth. It went really well. And then we had great collaboration on that one. We had wildlife, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service, and Fish Garden Siblings. We did a whole bunch of planting this year. This fall, we did 50 sod mats at Howard Slough and 50 sod mats at Farmington Bay. The ones that we did at Howard Slough, we used sod mats along a flow path that we're trying to maintain for increased water management. So it was kind of a cool first time experiment of trying to actually use revegetation to not just revegetate the wetlands, but also facilitate our water management. And then we also had about 5,000 to 10,000 pollinator plants that we installed. And most of those went Farmington Bay. We might still have a whole ground. Maybe you guys want to come help me. I'm taking my first one. Fall mowing, that's another thing that we did this year. That was kind of a first, was trying to get a bunch of stuff mowed in the fall prior to hunting season underway. And normally we haven't done that, but we just have so much work to get done, and we are seeing that our contractors are not getting it all done. We were able to line up a bunch of projects to get done this fall. This is just my reminder to mention the EPA project on Utah Lake. So now I'm switching gears to Utah Lake. And Emily will talk a lot about this project, but we did a big effort on Utah Lake in the spring. Did disking and seeding of about 30 acres on the north shore of Utah Lake. And then for Utah Lake, I just kind of have an update on success at Utah Lake. So this year, since 2020, we've been spraying the entire shoreline, spot spraying fragmented on the entire shoreline around Utah Lake. This year, they only found 700 acres by air and about 700 acres in ground, 1,500 acres total, which is basically an 88% reduction in Phragmites for max extent. So we only have about 12% Phragmites cover. So that's really exciting. And then interestingly, Sam will talk a little bit about the seed bank study, but with this Phragmites seed bank viability study, we found that at about 4 years, this when the viability significantly decreases. And that actually correlates well with once we sprayed the entire shoreline, it's on year 4 that we saw this big jump in Phragmites reduction. So my hope is we might see something similar on Great Salt Lake. We're getting back pretty close to working on a whole lake-wide scale, and so we work at lake-wide scale for 3 to 5 years, then we'll see this significant reduction. And then Utah Lake, there's also a ton of planting going on through the Utah Lake Authority. They had another 10,000 pollinator plants and then thousands of plants from North Fork. So we're doing a whole lot of revegetation around Utah Lake. And then for the Jordan River, Jen's is carried on a bunch of project sites that Ray got started. And we actually now have 12 sites that totals about 140 acres up and down the Jordan River. And for all of that, land ownership, we have to develop all these partnerships with cities and counties and adjacent landowners. So we have all these new partners, 10 partners that we provide some grant funding. Usually they bring resources to the projects as well. We're also doing a lot of Russian olive and tamarisk removal and whole bunch of planting. And this photo shows one of the areas that we're working in. It's pretty exciting how drastically the river is changing pretty quickly. This is actually looking top screen, so through the right bank. It's all Phragmites, and then there's some Russian olive and tamarisk mixed in here. And we have not done any treatments here. On the left bank, we've been doing Phragmites treatments and planting, and there's a little bit of Phragmites, but we're seeing a whole bunch of plant diversity, as well as some pretty good success with our plantings. And it gives really just like a totally different character, and it's pretty exciting. And then here's what these sites look like on the Jordan River. So they're basically a stretch of the whole reach of the Jordan River, from Utah Lake almost all the way to the wetlands of Great Salt Lake. And a lot of that work is done right now with the Utah Conservation Corps. And it's pretty daunting when you get it. It's really sitting on the river here, Phragmites towering above, and a lot of it is really hard to reach places you can get the boat, and we're doing a lot of work by hand. So then for our program updates, just overall, Arlo and Talon have now been with us for a year, which has been super helpful. So like every year presenting like, oh, this is the largest acreage ever, I'm doing more, and it kind of for a while surpassed my capacity. And so it's been great to have their positions getting finished done. And then we have 2 new positions posted right now that I mentioned. So they're both open until November 30th. And we have a field coordinator position. Online, they're both listed as restoration coordinators, but this field coordinator position will be more field oriented and geared towards overseeing probably a seasonal field tech crew that we hire on next year, overseeing conservation corps crews, doing a lot of our equipment, and then dealing with a bunch of small properties that we have a whole bunch of vegetation work going on that really needs a lot of upkeep. So it's pretty cool with the first job. And then the Utah Lake Port Restoration Coordinator position is actually going to be housed with the Utah Lake Authority. So it will be a split position with Utah Lake Authority and Forest Fire and State Lands, and it's housed in Provo, strictly working in Utah Lake. And then we have new equipment coming too. We have a new Marsh Master on order. We will have 2 Forest Fire and State Lands, about 2 Marsh Masters. We have a new repair boat hopefully coming soon. And we've talked about a bunch of equipment that we're going to share with the Utah Lake Authority and Utah County down in Utah Lake, and that would probably be available for work on Great Salt Lake and Jordan River as well. And then across the board, we're really ramping up all of our revegetation efforts, which takes a lot of additional coordination, and we have all these new positions to help do that. And then now that we have that in place, there's the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office has this water delivery program. It's a $15 million grant. We're going to apply for a good chunk of money from that strictly to increase native plant supply. With all our efforts, and we'll probably share those plans with other people. But that's everything I have.
Awesome.
How did I do?
Great. Okay, thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to
Okay, we have Ray Robinson here from 425 State Land. She'll introduce more and her people. But for those of you in my lab, you might recognize Ray's name from publications. Ray. She was a graduate student and then lab manager for him. Exams. Exam mirror. There we go. Yeah.
Oh, he didn't like you. Yeah, I'm Ray Robinson, restoration coordinator up here for Bear Lake and Bear River. And yeah, just a few updates from some of our work this past year. I'm going to start talking about Bear Lake and our aquatic plant monitoring and treatment, our herbaceous noxious weed control, our noise control. And then I'll, at the end, talk about our work on the Bear River, specifically our projects on the lower Bear with Ducks Unlimited and some other project work that we get into. So if you don't know, Eurasian water milfoil is a large focus for us at Bear Lake. For a little context, we do have the native northern water milfoil. They tend to grow in the same spots. But the native northern is not a target for us. But the Eurasian water milfoil certainly is for monitoring. And again, if you don't know, it is a huge problem. It can really impact recreation, safety for swimmers, boaters. Like a lot of invasive plants, it's outcompeting your native vegetation and spreading very quickly, diminishing any good fish and wildlife habitat that you had. And it was first detected in Bear Lake in 2019, and now it's present around the So this past summer was my second summer on Bear Lake, and we really set out to have a goal to better map these aquatic plants, which, as you can imagine, is kind of challenging. So this year we invested in a fish finder, like sonar for our boat, and then also this software called BioBase. And so essentially what you do is you drive the boat in Transx and you're collecting sonar data, and then you upload that data to this subscription-based software. And it gives you modeled biovolume of aquatic plants in the water column. So you're getting water depth and then you're getting top of plants. And so that's going to give you a proportion of plants in the water column. And then to complement that data that we collected on the boat with our fish finder, we also use jet ski boats, and we go out and we follow a grid and we throw a rake so that you can see what plants are on there. So that's kind of more like point data for us. And we also use last year's data to help guide our monitoring. And sometimes you can actually use aerial imagery to see the pattern. So it's kind of a hybrid approach. And then the marinas are of special interest. So there are 5 small marinas in Utah on their lake. And as you can imagine, they're shallower, warmer, and so they tend to foster these invasive aquatic plants, which is a big issue for folks that are recreating or running jet skis and such out of the industry. So we'll check in really regularly on. Okay, so this is what it kind of looked like when we did our monitoring and then used our monitoring to inform treatments. So if you want to key in on like the red and the green points, that's where we would have thrown a rake. And red is we found your H1 nopal on the rake. Green is we went there and it was not on the rake. And then the bio volume, it's the highest we had was about 33% of the water column occupied by plants. So anywhere in blue is like the boat ran there and it's telling us that there's not plants there. And then it's a heat map. So anything in yellow is like 15% of the water column about had aquatic plants. And you can see that kind of lines up with our lakes. So it's like confirming that there are plants there and those plants are your H1 nopal. And then the rectangle in red is the treatment polygon that I would have drawn around it and given to our contractor. And so then they can go out and treat that rectangle. So it's about 5 acres. And this is just one spot. We had 3 different spots this year. So I was really excited about this. This is like, not gonna lie, it's one of like the best looking monitoring to treatment situations that we had. Sometimes the data wasn't certain, like super clean from Biobase, but I think overall it is a tool that we're going to keep using and keep refining because when it does turn out like this, it's like super straightforward as to where the plants are and where we need to treat. So I was kind of excited by that. We did end up treating all 5 marinas in late June with diclofenac and aquafol to kill the curly pondweed and the H1 nopal. And then I did a follow-up treatment with 2,4-gene amine to treat the uration that either didn't die or came back in one of the marinas in August. And then we worked with our contractor. They did a test plot of this Renovate OTF with the granular trichopyr herbicide in late June. That was to inform the concentration for larger treatments later in summer. So then they came back. We worked with Aquatechnics and they treated 50 acres across 3 different spots in late August with trichopyr. So that's them. They actually they're running these bags and like dumping them into the hoppers here. Transects, polygons that we did.
And that's a contractor you said?
Yeah, Aquatechnics. What I'm really excited about is our partnership with Marilla Ortiz's lab. She is a graduate student that's working with us. They're looking at a lot of different things for us to inform our management. I guess I'll just kind of highlight what I'm most excited about is they're going to do a bunch of greenhouse experiments looking at different herbicide concentrations and exposure time for both curly leaf and H1 nopal. And so that's going to be so useful for us. And then a handful of other things too. But overall, the current situation is the nopal is pretty widespread in the lake. Based off our monitoring this year, it does seem like the treatments that we did last year with Accelacor did not control the plants very well. So like we would return to the same spot that we treated as it kind of looks like we didn't do anything. And so that's why this summer we switched to a different herbicide and the effectiveness is kind of to be determined. I think like a lot of herbicide treatments, you don't always see it right away. So like next summer's growth is maybe a better indicator than after we did this year. Yeah, so fingers crossed on that one. And I see this just remaining a large focus at Bear Lake because recreation and fisheries really move up there. And it's a big issue and a big concern. So I'm sure in years to come, you'll hear more about this. Throughout the summer, we are staying busy, so we hire some seasonals and we use UTV, ATVs, backpack sprayers, and we try to cover the whole shoreline, which is about 27 miles, the Utah side. of Bear Lake, and we're just going after the state listed noxious weeds, which is on the screen there. So yeah, it's a lot of hard work, and really rely on our seasonal to do that. As for Phragmites, there was a lot of groundwork laid in the early 2000s and 2010s by our division, my division, and also Fish and Wildlife Service and others, where they were treating large acres of Phragmites with airplanes and then burning those patches. And so now there's not that much there at Bear Lake, although it is kind of sparse along the west side, which is where you find more of the emergent plant community. So yeah, we do our best to spray it, water glyphosate, in late August, early September. Mason was out there a lot with me, trekking through the marsh, trying to be thorough and spraying what is there. And then we'll come back. We've been doing that last week and we'll do that tomorrow. Just brush cutting anything that is super dense. There's not a ton of it, but any little bit that we can brush cut down to improve next year's access, it'll be worth it. And some of these spots where we treated Phragmites for at least a couple of years, it has opened up a bit and given us a good opportunity to plant. So I worked with Karin's class. We got these plants from the prison, and we were working with Mindy Wheeler's group to get these plants. And that was really awesome. We had a beautiful day in mid-September, and we planted pretty densely in a small area. And the goal was really just to improve diversity. We do have a lot of good cover of graminoids, but I think that we could enhance the native forest diversity. So that was kind of the point of this. And then we signed it, UPS'd it, and decided to go back next year and just see what it looks like. All right, shifting gears a little bit here. Our work on the lower Bear River, we're kind of scaling up a little bit. We've been more boots on the grounds at Bear Lake. And so this work with Ducks Unlimited that we have, we're completing the first year right now, and it'll go until 2029. It's kind of an opportunity for us to really learn more about the river. And so DU is doing a ton of work in terms of like collecting LiDAR data, multispectral imagery to help map the invasive plants. Mitch and Karina have done a ton of field work this year, and we're going to get a lot of this like geomorphic and hydrological assessments. So we'll learn more about the river. We'll learn more exactly where the problems are on the river. And then DU is going to help us kind of like synthesize that information and say, okay, so forestry fire state land, like here are the best practices that you guys can implement to actually improve river function, river health. Here are the opportunities, here are the partners, and here are what some of these, either bank restoration or floodplain reconnection, here are like what those strategies look like. This is how you implement it. So really looking forward to seeing how this project develops. And then, I mean, I'm all for like studying the river, but also this project will culminate with at least one pilot project along the river. So there'll be an actual project that we can return to, point to, and then take that experience and see if we want to implement it in other places on the river, or maybe take it to other sovereign lands where we're dealing with the same issues. Because a lot of our big rivers that are sovereign lands are experiencing similar. And then lastly, in addition to the DU work on the Bear River, I want to point out that Cache and Boxwater County, we have agreements with them, and they really extend our reach. So they're spraying weeds for us along the river and then also on adjacent lands. And so we're really grateful for that partnership. We have spray days for goat root and purple blue stripe on the river through the Northern Utah CWMA. And then we've also helped out partners control weeds at the Bear River bottoms in Trenton, and then also places. So there's Mason just last week. All this Phragmites had been sprayed by the county, and then we told them we can come in and brush cut. So there he is before, and then after there's actually snow there with water. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks for listening.
As we're transitioning to Chad, Greg, the renovate Riverside, people have really hungry problems on Great Salt Lake and Hammond. Can they use that there? You know,
the. So not the trunk here,
Yeah.
yeah. But there are some that kill both, so the dicot and aquapol will kill curly leaf and Eurasian. So Galleon is another one that I believe targets both.
No, there were some spots in Sandy, where it's any kind of fair amount. On the comments. All right, we've got Chad Cranny here. Chad, will you please also introduce the many DWR folks here?
Yeah, we've got a whole crew here. It's great.
Great. And for my students, if you've, Chad was at USU in the days of Christine Rohal and Chad Cranny. My tall, short team crew. There's the Cranny.
Yeah, let's get a picture together. I was like, big next.
Yeah, please introduce your various folks.
Yeah, we got everybody here today. So I'll start off down south. We've got Dave England. He was actually a former student in this lab as well. He's the manager of Farmington Bay and Tempe Springs. Wyatt Hansen is the assistant manager of those places. And
You guys wait just so they find out who you are, but yeah, thanks Wyatt. He's here.
I was actually thinking Dave's probably really mad that there's this big skid sled that pull across the mud flat and take these rhizomes out. Dave was pulling around rhizome mats with sleds behind his back.
He's tougher for it.
Over a quarter mile. I was like, oh, that's easy. And then Rich Hansen, he's manager at Ogden Bay, Howard Slough, and Harold Crane. His assistant, Colton. And then we have myself, who manages public shooting grounds, Locomotive Springs and Salt Creek, and Stephen Hunt, who's the assistant out there. He's been here for about a year now. And then a new manager and part of our wetland team now is Ashley Pajowski. She manages Blackhawk, Willard Spur, and Bear River Bay. And then her new assistant, as of last week, is Carter Page. He's been around as a technician and with the G-Sled crew for a while, but now he's got a permanent position. So we're happy to have him. And then we have some defectors like Arlo and Val. But yeah, so real quick, I'm just going to go through what we got done specifically with our Phragmites project this past year. Start with some mowing that we did in the spring. We actually did get quite a bit of mowing done. A lot of it was concentrated there on the Willard Spur, as you can see. The DWR staff, so just us, we mowed about 448 acres. Oh, that says, yep. Get some glasses. And then we contracted out a lot of that mowing on the spur, which is about 737 acres. We did get a number of burns done, the most we were able to get done in any year. This was a burn at Ogden Bay. You kind of see the burn scar there. We burned probably about 300 acres. I think we were shooting for a little over 400 on that burn, but that ended up being a really good one. This was a burn at Harold Crane, and we were actually working on this stuff to the north here, trying to burn that finger and some of the stuff to the east and west side of that impoundment. You can see it didn't do all that great. We've done a lot of work in this area in the past, so there just wasn't a lot of litter and whatnot to carry that fire. And maybe we're just not that good because somebody decided to go down south and light that up the same day. So we should have maybe taken lessons from that because they did a good job. We did have a very good burn at Salt Creek though. This was about 1,100 acres. Not a lot of Phragmites up there, as many of you know, but there was some frag in this area, but it was a lot of old decadent cattail, 3 square. So it was nice to get that burn and really open that marsh back up. Now we'll just move on to what we got sprayed this past fall. So all the rest of these maps, the yellow is the aerial spraying, purple is what we got sprayed on the ground. So in Farmington Bay, we sprayed about 400 acres from the air. A lot of that was concentrated in that one big yellow blob there, which is actually mostly tamarisk. We had a bunch of tamarisk come up in a dry pond, so we wanted to get that sprayed before Dave and Wyatt reflooded it, and it worked out great, right? Then we sprayed covered 467 acres with our ground equipment, which is a lot. what was that, 2.5 days, 3 days? Yeah, we were able to cover a lot. I think I've compared some maps from before, like 8-10 years ago. And you see that there's just like one area on the map that has color on it. And now we're able to get across the whole marsh, really. Howard Slough, we sprayed 80 acres from the air, covered about 144 acres on the ground. In Ogden Bay, 400 acres from the air and a whopping 720 acres on the ground. I don't think we've ever hit that at any one WMA. And that, yeah, we do have some better equipment than we used to, but that's also, we're not spraying as much frag, so we're able to cover a lot more ground without having to track back in and refill and whatnot. So we're covering a lot more ground every year. Harold Crane and Willock Spur, we had 1,150 acres sprayed from the air, and we covered 1,387 acres on the ground. All that ground spraying on these areas was contracted out, PMG. But as you can see, a lot of our efforts over the past couple of years have been concentrated on Spur. This was the 3rd year of treatments in that area where that big purple and yellow come together. That area is looking super good right now. The last year I was out there a number of times, and there's just a ton of more open areas. A lot of shorebirds nested in there in the spring and whatnot. It's pretty cool to see. Public shooting grounds, we did no aerial treatment up there, but we did cover about 325 acres on the ground. And Salt Creek, we sprayed 200 acres from the air, covered about 485 acres on the ground. And both, I mean, that was in 2.5 days. Just, again, we covered a lot of area, especially at Public and Salt Creek, where you're trying to drive as fast as you can to find frag before you fall asleep. So yeah, anyway, we covered a lot of area with these pieces of equipment. And then you can't have a presentation in the middle of duck hunting season without a duck hunting picture. So there's 3 OGs from the Wetland Ecology Lab in that picture there. There's a little trip to North Dakota, pretty fun time. But coming up, you know, we got about 1,000 to 1,500 acres that we want to mow and trample. Going to try and burn about 500 acres at Ogden Bay this spring. And then also assist forestry fire with any fires that they have going on. And then really trying hard to work with Jen and the refuge on some water and whatnot, trying to treat some other areas on the Willard Spur. That's all I got.
Yeah, does DWR have any plans to hire people in the next 6 to 8 months?
Unfortunately, we hired 2 recently. Well, fortunately, we don't have any openings coming up. We might have some summer technicians openings coming in April or May. Yeah, that didn't come out right.
We have Jen right here from Wildlife Service back from furlough. Very exciting that we got her back in the nick of time. And I think it was a bit of a stretch to get here today with everything, the backlog. Really take it and done. Thanks.
Yeah. Good to see everybody. I remember I have like a month to put this together, so some of the slides aren't like the way I want them to because they don't have time to work on maps. Bear with me. Oh yeah, and you guys remember that little fire that started in we were out in the airports when it started. So this year we've had a 5-year contract in place that's been really successful. We're mainly focusing on cameras and frag, but the hand cutting with cameras, you know, time consuming, but we're trying to reach areas that are in the past. Our maintenance guys have used heavy equipment to like pull the cameras out and pile them up, but this way they're just, you know, doing the hack and squirt, you know, cut and treat. And it's much more effective because you get the little fingers when you pull them out of the excavator. So we've had great success with that. The large ground spray projects, we got not as much done as I wanted, but especially partnering. This year we had we graded, where we just coordinated with others, like so Arlo came out and helped us spray at our education center, and that was a super big help because we just have a marsh master and very few people that can operate it. So Arlo was able to bring the marsh master and help us wet for the half a day at the education center. And with grazing, it's still about 9,000 acres where the cattle have been focusing. We're finding a little better every year. The prescribed burn was super successful. I put 2,000 acres, it's a little less than that because it included the barrier bay. And then we're still treating purple leaf spread. There's new locations that popped up this year. This is from last year, and the reason I kept it in is because it shows the areas that we've been using actually every year. And I hope the polygons will be a little smaller because we're trying to get the virtual collars on all the grazers. So with the aerial spraying, we worked through Forest Fire and State Lands because the federal government, it's so hard to do anything, right? So it's hard for us to physically contract with an aerial sprayer. So we piggyback on this contractor, and we got about 500 acres. Prescribed burn is Keith had talked about. This is the day after. You can see all black. So we were super happy, and then it was like smoking for 2 days. Thank you very much. That was a great effort. This again is last year's picture, but it shows behind the education center. The education center is up at the top. We've been trying to open up some areas. Folks have been volunteering there for a while. We're like, it's really filling in the vegetation. Why can't we see more open water and mud flats like we had in the past? So we've been focusing on opening up areas, seeing avocets, blacknecks. So this is year 2 of this effort. It's been very successful. Again, this is last year's map, but these are the actual acres that we did mechanical treatment. These are both with Wasatch Region. We have a partnership with them. Most of the area was focused in Unit 2C. That polygon is not active. And then spraying, we got about 1,200 acres done on the ground. Last year's map, sorry about that. So our 5-year agreement with Wasatch Wiggins, this was the first full year that we've been like integrated and making a lot of progress. They adopted this unit that has 700 acres. It was a slow start because we only have one marsh master and it had been used intermittently and hadn't been used consistently, so it was constantly breaking down this year. I felt really bad for Troy because it would keep you out there making a lot of progress, get a couple days worth of work done, and then boom, it was just. And it turns out it was numerous things. It wasn't just one thing. It's a fuel filter, you name it. So that poor MM2 has been through a lot, but we're getting there. And if any of you've been out to the refuge, seeing that corner unit 2C looks a lot better than it did. So a lot of the challenges we've been facing is loss of personnel. We've lost 2 maintenance positions. One of them, the guy is retiring at the end of this year, and he's our water guy. So we're hoping that we'll be able to hire behind him. Right now, the deputy is going to be doing all the water management, and then all systems, of course. I've been doing the east side water management, more of the grassland area water management, but the big units, Big C and the rest of the beaches done by our deputy until maybe a partial hydrologist maintenance person. So fingers crossed, if anybody's interested, I'll let you know when we advertise. But with this past year, with such high evaporation and transpiration loss, it was so dry because it's that UV index was super high every day. So even though we had a fairly normal water heater, it was just that UV index was dry. So it's super hard to do any water management. And then when you've got a trickle coming down Bear River, there's not much you can do. We've been having some beaver issues, not terrible, but we're working closely with her to translocate those beavers. And again, I mentioned about the virtual collars. I'm hoping to keep the cattle from munching on all the alkali bulrush and other native plants that we want to encourage to grow instead of just letting them pitch on the edge of the frag stands or more into the frag stands. So I'm hoping next year we'll be able to have virtual collars for most of the cattle. And from what they've seen, it's the cows that get the collars. Some of the companies say you can put a collar on a bull, but that's yet to be seen. Their necks are so deep. So with that, it's the only question.
Again, as we transition to Brittany. So it'll be our last talk before we take a break.
Kathleen Green, she's been in Texas here and a whole bunch of them.
You were a graduate from
And I'm always so impressed. Especially in January. Okay. Today, just doing a quick update. So we have our noxious weed list, which is like written into the law, exactly which weeds can be like enforced for people to treat, things like that. So I think I've talked about this before. We have our different classes here. Class 1A is when it's like on the watch list, so it's not in the state yet. And then 1B is like new in the state, smaller populations, but still likely possibly able to eradicate. And it goes all the way down from there. And, so what's really interesting is there's different enforcement rules for each of the classes. So the first floor, the counties actually have the authority to enforce treatment to eradicate species on people's private property, things like that. So it's a pretty big deal to get something listed on this list. And then the top 4 species is just like no sell. So they have inspectors within the nursery. And even like Walmart, wherever seed packs are sold, they'll go in and make sure that noxious seeds aren't being sold. But people can still have the plant on their property and they won't be forced trading, but like Russian olive, for example. So they have a new mandate out, like our commissioner does, to simplify rules. So this might be changing altogether soon in the next little bit. But the exciting thing is that we actually have seen some changes to the list this year. So we had African rue and multi-scar thistle was both on the watch list. And they're both discovered in Utah in 2019. And they've been like treated. African rue is almost fully eradicated, which is exciting. Multi-scar thistle was actually mis-ID'd as yellow scar thistle for a really long time. So it spread and was kind of well established. So both of those moved to the 1B instead of the 1A. And also another really interesting one is Bermuda grass. And it was not allowed in all those counties except for Washington County because it's a really drought resistant grass. So that's like the only grass they could grow down there. So we were like, you guys are good, no one else can have it. And then they discovered a new triploid hybrid Bermuda grass that, the seeds aren't viable. So that is now allowed for all of you. If any of you are interested in Bermuda grass for your yard. And then so the ones that are actually here, Eurasian watermelon photo is now officially listed. It took a really long time. It was first found or brought to UW's attention in 2018, and it's been treated ever since. Yeah, so in 2025, we're officially listed. It's a pretty intensive process where I have to go out for a public review. Multiple communities have to vote on it. So where we go makes it easier to fund. And then also parrot feather was a parrot. So this was found in 2021. We began treatment in 2024, right near Goxner's Cheese. There's a pretty big population right there. So yeah, and that's about it. New species are added.
Keep an eye out for that one. That one is, that is an intense plant.
Yes.
Holy cow, I've seen the pictures of what happened at Gospers.
It's like, so it grows both under and out of the water. And it's so dense, you can't even tell there's water there. So if you didn't know what you were looking for, you just. It's
If you think you might be spotting it, don't hesitate to reach out.
for sure. There was
Yeah,
a few kind of in central Utah, there's a few reports of this not possibly being there.
Yeah.
And I think there was like 4, and 2 of them were actually parrot feather. So it's more than has actually been reported on the NMAPs. So, yeah. If you do find either of those, let us know.
we will.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Yeah, it's a very scary one. And like with Eurasian watermelon foil, we could go out and like throw a rake and pull it up to sample it and see where it is. And with this one, like the roots are so strong, the rake doesn't, it just like confones it instead of pulling up. So it's a lot more difficult to.
Do we know about the treatment?
Marilla, let's use.
Plant soils and climate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're studying it right now, like best herbicide, and they treated it with. I need to write this down before I came on. I don't remember, but I can look it up and
So
tell you.
like, I,
Yes, and when we went out and took pictures this past fall, it didn't look like it was super effective. And we had to come back a little bit. Yeah. I don't know. It was good, I think.
great. Any questions for Brittany? Questions for anybody? Or you can phone her, well, we'll take a quick break here for about 10 minutes and then we'll hop back at 10:10. Rena. If you didn't get a name tag, please grab one now. Yeah, you run out.
Yeah. We want to be on the pod this Zoom.
Oh, but. I was just thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Back.
Yeah, what's your surrounding economy of that on Great Salt Lake? Tributaries and certain. Yeah, so I work for Ducks Unlimited. I'm a regional biologist. I cover Utah and Southern Idaho. Most of my time really being spent in Utah, helping grow our conservation program here, which I'm going to give a very broad overview of today. I don't know if everyone is super familiar with Ducks Unlimited. I wasn't when I started because we didn't have a big presence in the state, but we are a 501c nonprofit. Our mission is to conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North America's waterfowl. These habitats also benefit other wildlife people. We pretty much work across all 50 states. We also have subsidiary arms in Canada and Mexico to kind of support the animal life cycle of all waterfowl species across North America. To kind of like really distill what the organization does in like a really simplified version, we focus really on like dirt moving wetland restoration projects. We work in teams of biologists and engineers to talk with private landowners and public wetland land managers to kind of scope, prospect, fund, design, and deliver these wetland restorations. We obviously do a lot of other things. We're a big organization. We have over 700 employees just in the US and about, this number might be kind of old now, but probably about 450 folks that work in just conservation. But in Utah, we're a little bit smaller. We now have 3 conservation staff. So I was the first person that they hired here in Utah in 2022. We now have another biologist, and then we have a civil engineer, our biologist, Mitch Jenkins, who's working on our Lower Bear River restoration. Corey Walsh is our civil engineer who helps design all of our awesome projects. We also have policy development and grassroots staff, right? So we're a nonprofit, so we rely really heavily on private funding mechanisms to help support and build our programs, as well as have a robust events fundraising system and a water policy outreach specialist who helps advocate for things in the state legislature and legislative appropriations to support work on Great Salt Lake. And we are pretty much solely Great Salt Lake and Lower Bear River focused. Great Salt Lake kind of being the primary habitat for migratory waterfowl in Utah, and of course, 80% of our wetlands in the state. And we've been really fortunate in the last 3 years to unlock about $16.5 million in public funding to support our work in the state. I'm not going to read this list, but this is kind of a very broad overview. These are all the projects we have delivered between 2023 and this year on private and public lands, representing about a $7.2 million investment and enhancing or restoring over 5,000 acres of habitat. These are all of our projects that we currently have funded that are in various stages of design and working through environmental compliance to ensure a delivery window of either next summer or summer 2027. Working in wetlands, we have sort of a narrow delivery of when these projects can get delivered. But I guess backing up a little bit, you know, when we started working in this landscape, because Ducks Unlimited has this really particular niche where we have civil and structural engineers on our staff, we work a lot in wetland infrastructure, right? Like we have all these managed wetlands around Great Salt Lake that are heavily dependent on having functional infrastructure to maintain the timing, depth, and duration of flooding to support optimal habitat conditions. And we just got together in rooms with people like Dave and Rich and Chad, and they were just like, infrastructure is failing and it's falling apart. And it's original to when the WMA was built in the 1930s, and if it doesn't get replaced, we can't manage our wetlands appropriately. And obviously that ties into a lot of other management actions like dealing with invasive species, because we need appropriate timing of hydrology to spray phragmites. So that is a lot of what our program has been thus far focused on, and I'll go in a little more specifics to some of the projects that we're have delivered or have funded. So a lot of our funding has come from mostly state funding. Like I said, the state has made really significant investment into Great Salt Lake and have realized that their wetlands are a priority and are really a part of the lake, and those habitats are important to preserve and protect in perpetuity. But you know, we have our private funding mechanism through our Great Salt Lake Initiative. We've received 2 grants from the North American Wetlands Conservation Act as the federal grant program. We received a number of grants from the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust. They got a $10 million legislative appropriation to support wetland restoration work around Great Salt Lake. And then we've received some funding as well through the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, State Land, as well as the Division of Wildlife Resources has also contributed to the state development matching fund, which you can see a number of these. Okay, so I'll just start kind of give an overview of some of our work at Farmington Bay, which I think everyone's very familiar with. We have kind of 3 really big projects at Farmington Bay. These first 2 were just completed this summer. And then this next project of bypass canal replacement will be completed next summer. So these 3 projects are sort of replacing all of the big wetland or water delivery infrastructure at Farmington Bay. So to give you like a little more close up, also Dave, if you want. I've been at any point here, you're welcome to. Yeah. This is the lower Jordan River. This is where it comes into the state canal, which then delivers about 90% of the water to Farmington Bay. This Burnham Dam structure actually splits the water 50-50 between a private duck club called New State and to Farmington Bay. And then the rest of the water gets delivered through the structure called the State Dam. So the first part of this project was retrofitting the Burnham Dam structure. The structure itself was fine, but the gates on it were very, very difficult to operate. So we retrofitted it with gates that can now be operated remotely. And then the State Dam was essentially, I don't know, inoperable.
Yeah, we'd have to jump out on those footings there, and there's actually boards in those. But it's not very fun. Not ideal.
1930 building, 39. Yeah, and then there's like this big breach on like on this side, right? And water's just going around the dam. So right, and like big runoff events, big storm surges, not very effective at moving water into the WMA. And so this was a really big project. And this is what it looks like now here on the right. So it's a big concrete structure with 6 ticking weirs that are also can be operated remotely, which is a big deal because this is actually about a 15-minute drive from the Farmington Bay headquarters. So Dave doesn't have to drive out there now and then risk his life by pulling the boards and into the concrete. And right after we got it installed was like a 140-year storm. So yeah, really good timing. But we finished it by then, but also cool to see the fruits of this labor and coming to fruition and realizing that having a modern infrastructure to deliver water to these really important areas is really for them. And then another really big project that will get delivered this is the bypass canal. So as the name would suggest, this is the primary means that they can bypass water around some of the units and directly out to Great Salt Lake, and also is the primary means of filling some of his units as well. These structures are also just kind of at the end of their lifespan. It's actually a project from about 25 years ago, but just have better equipment now to install. And then this is gonna get delivered next summer. And it's funded by, Great Salt Lake Water Enhancement Trust and one of our NACA grants. That's what the structures look like. They're also kind of operate. I heard they gave Jason, purple tunnel. So hopefully we can save days before it really.
Maybe this next summer. You could.
It'll be nice.
I think so.
Yeah, we might be. You're young. Some projects we've completed recently at Ogden Bay. This is the South Run levee. So this is the South Run of the Weaver River that is also kind of this direct hydrologic nexus to the a theme we're seeing over and over again is that a lot of the levees in our WMAs are pretty heavily eroded and in some cases pretty close to breaching in some areas. And these aren't the most glamorous of projects, but they are essential to maintain all of this emergent marsh habitat in our WMAs and to deliver water efficiently. Rich, if you have anything to add, so, this is what it looks like now. I don't know the before photo, but there were a lot of areas that were pretty badly eroded and swept off. This is another project coming up at Ogden Bay next summer. This is kind of more of like a real proper restoration project. So this is an area called Unit 2. This is a levee that was built probably also in the 1930s, but was washed away in the floods between the 80s and 90s, and they never really had enough funding to rebuild it and restore this area. So it's kind of interesting, like, because, you know, Rich doesn't want to sheet flow water out here in the middle of the summer. He's just going to go grow Phragmites. He doesn't really take water in the summer, and the area is quite dry in the summer months. So it's not really providing much like semi-permanent or perennial habitat to support the like full season needs of nesting birds. And so we're going to restore this levee, and it's really going to be like a very low elevation berm with a number of water control structures so that he'll be able to actually effectively manage the water depth out there to support more year-round habitat. And this is going to be delivered next week. This is a kind of a similar flavor project. This is another levee that was washed away by historic floods. This project is actually partially on the TMC shorelands preserve, partially state sovereign lands. It's sort of a partnership with both of those entities. This is going to restore about 627 wetland acres. Right now, kind of a similar story. They don't really have water control out here, so they kind of just get this like sheet flow in the summer, or they'll have rain events that, because they don't have any way to move water off of this area or impound water, it's basically just a frag stand out there. So it's really providing very minimal to no habitat value. And restoring this levee is going to allow them to maintain more optimal water depths, start like actively treating all the Phragmites out there now that they can manage the water. And this was supposed to be delivered this summer, but because of the stuff with the federal government, they sort of froze some of our grants that had already been awarded. But it was released, but not in time to actually go to construct. So this will also get constructed next summer. Another project that we have funded up at Salt Creek. This is the bypass channel at Salt Creek. It's how Chad delivers water to the main marsh unit and then bypasses water down to public shooting grounds. It has several really bad breachers in it. Again, it's not functional, and my understanding is that NASA can't drain the main marsh because the bypass channel doesn't work effectively. So we'll be restoring this in summer 2027. This project is funded by the Utah Division of Forest and Retired State Lands through their wetland grants program. And then finally, Ray did an awesome job giving an overview of this project, so this might be a bit redundant, but we have this really cool multi-year restoration project on the lower Bear River from Cutler Dam to the Migratory Bird Refuge. So it is a pretty ambitious 65-mile reach. But like I mentioned, a lot of this project right now is just kind of getting to know the river better and trying to understand what the potential restoration opportunities could be across different sections or different reaches of the river, because as you can imagine, like the habitat conditions are pretty different, like as the further up you go versus, you know, all the way down to the refuge and the agricultural lands and buffaloes. So this is we have a $5 million contract with USU FFSL over 5 years. We are partnering with SWICA. They're providing more like geotechnical, hydrogeomorphological expertise, and it's not something that someone really particularly specialized in. The idea of this project is, you know, we really want to identify some pilot restoration projects that could focus on addressing issues like reconnecting floodplains where appropriate, addressing a lot of channel incision and a lot of sections of the Bear River like this, with these really vertical in size cut banks, and so addressing this is going to be a really big issue along the river. Restoring a riparian habitat corridor in a lot of areas, addressing issues with invasive species, primarily Phragmites, Tamarack, and Russian olive. And then in some cases, protecting threatened infrastructure where the river has moved a lot over time, and there's some areas where there's very narrow levee or infrastructure between some emergent marshes and the river itself that are very close to breach. This is our kind of proposed timeline for the project, and now we're in this like baseline assessment part of the project. So the baseline assessment has included our partner coming out and doing a lot of hydrology and geomorphology surveys. They were out on a boat this summer doing a bunch of just like physical surveys of the river. Mitch and I went and surveyed 65 sites every mile along the river and collected species vegetation surveys and soils every 3rd mile. Our GIS team is doing an extensive mapping effort of all the invasive species in the 65-mile reach, and so they came out with ground truth, a bunch of data to inform their models. And then we had a contractor come out and fly LiDAR and ortho imagery, so kind of collating all of that data now to develop that into an action plan to then give to portion files. Not that little bit out on summer or out in the summer. Sometimes, unfortunately, pushing it through a lot of sandbars because there is not a lot of water in the river during irrigation season. Maybe also another issue that is beyond the scope of the project. Yeah, that's all I have.
Quick question. So you're saying some places the river is like almost, I'm assuming it's really in size, and that it's almost spilling into an adjacent marsh. Could you say more about like why we really don't want that? Like what if the river just is moving?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some amount of like channel migration that's totally natural and normal, but obviously like humans don't like that.
Yeah.
And in these cases, like I think like because of the elevation between the marsh and the river, like the whole water would be understood just like get sucked into the river, and it was like not keep it at the marsh. Okay. So
Sorry, Karina, I'm distracted.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds great.
Okay, awesome. All right, we are gonna switch gears a little bit.
Yeah.
So right now. Yeah, there's a point of and then okay.
Oh yeah. What is all right, we are we're talking about progress on the land with the management restoration projects collaboration. Now we're going to move on to some of the research
And first up is Sandy Johnston, who has been working as a research scientist in our lab the last couple of years, focused on submerged aquatic vegetation. So I'm going to Sandy again.
Okay, like Karen said, I've been working with a lot of aquatic vegetation. So with every experiment, you always have some questions.
I think if you click the screen, then the clicker might work.
Okay, so we have this question. The first one, very wide question. How does aquatic plant performance vary by species in restoration? Then what are the best reintroduction methods for different aquatic plant species? And for this, based off of several experiments beforehand, I chose to use cuttings versus pellet plugs. The pellets, just this little ball of heat that some of the plants really like, and really don't like, and then you just have air cutting for the well. And then what are the best practices to restore aquatic plant communities in the face of carp? For this, we use fencing versus open areas. The dotted line one is open, and the solid line is fenced. This is just an example from Farmington Bay that we made that of. So the species we used was spiny naiad, water smartweed, longleaf pondweed, spiral ditchgrass, small pondweed, horn pondweed, whitewater crowfoot, and sago. So if we go to Farmington Bay Unit 1, we have fencing and open areas for carp. I'll be able to talk about that a little bit later. We have lots of natural diversity. And Farmington Bay was mostly chosen because we went early in the spring to see what was there, and that is not the right time to go see what's there. The best time to go look at a site is in the middle of the season when everything is in full growth. So at Farmington Bay, we saw the whitewater crowfoot did really well in year 1, but then completely vanished in year 2. Longleaf pondweed also performed really well in year 1, and it was the only planting that I actually was able to see in year 2. So this is the raw data from Farmington Bay. The y-axis is the average cover, and it's just in a proportion from 0 to 1. The x-axis is the dates. Each of these is split into 2 years, so 2024 on the left side of each graph and 2025 on the right side. And then we have up in the top left our pellets, and these are just the quadrats where I have planted pellets. And then same thing with cuttings. And then I have an inner control that was among all of the different quadrats that contain pellets and cuttings, and then an outer control just to make sure that if one of them like totally blew up and like threw a whole ton, then it wouldn't actually be affected, and we'd actually get some valid control. So our first one here is whitewater crowfoot. You can see it kind of goes up kind of far and then just completely disappears. It makes me kind of think that it might be an annual plant rather than a perennial, but that's a whole other topic. We can talk a lot about some of them. So you can see it went up really far. And in analysis, when I did analysis on these, it showed that cuttings did better slightly than pellets. And then we have longleaf pondweed, and highlighted it there. This one also through analysis showed that pellets did slightly better than cuttings. And then the last area was just fencing, and this area is all the open area. So last year it was very interesting to see that all like algae took over the entire area and got rid of pretty much all the plants that were there. And this year was very different. So I don't know if it was like just the amount of water, if there was nutrients in the soil, but this year the algae didn't show up at quite that level, which was very interesting. Not entirely
So the second site that I'm gonna talk about is Harold Crane, the northwest pond. It had a lot of native vegetation, as you can see from the picture. It had some carp, but we did not do fencing. We had some successful plantings, and we also used salinity acclimation because the salt levels were a little bit high. And what we'll be talking about is small pondweed, whitewater crowfoot again, and then long pondweed again. And this picture of longleaf pondweed is actually an example from Harold Crane and the quadrat that I am in. So again, we have the average cover on the y-axis, and then the dates on the x-axis, which was just done in 2025. There's no fencing. We have the pellet areas and cuttings, which were the treatments that I did, and then we have inner control among the pellets and cuttings, and then outer control, which was separate. So we have whitewater crowfoot. It did a lot less here, but we can still see that cuttings did a little bit better, and I got significance in that analysis as well. And then we have longleaf pondweed, which it definitely did better with pellets than it did with cuttings. And analysis told me that too. And then we have small pondweed, which went way over the top. It exploded when we put it out there. It did really well. And some of you might be thinking, well, how come it didn't do the same thing in Farmington Bay? Well, so in year one, when I was propagating these plants, I gave about 4 weeks for each plant to be able to like just grow and get big enough and produce roots. And this one, by the time we got to week 4, they all died. They all gave up. So in 2025, I only planted them for 2 to 3 weeks, and these are super fast growing plants. And so if you can see down here, it's multiplied itself. I put 1 little stalk in there, and now there's like 6 or 7 there, and a lot of these roots are about 6 inches long. So it's kind of crazy and kind of amazing, and it does really, really well in restoration. All right, so what are the best species for restoration under which method? So I have the 3 different species that I talked about. Whitewater crowfoot. It would probably be better for short-term plantings to be able to fill an area pretty early in the season. These are plants that generally like to just kind of go near the bottom of the water table or the water and kind of spread along the ground. You don't generally see them come up until they start to flower. And then we have longleaf pondweed, and whitewater crowfoot does better in cuttings. Longleaf pondweed pellets do really well. This plant has floating leaves and it also has underwater leaves. And it's very hard to plant. It grows really well and it roots substantially. And then we have small pondweed, which is specific in growth. You really have to plant them for just 2 to 3 weeks. If you get up to 4, it will probably die. It is very fast growing and it duplicates a lot. And so these are the ones that I would suggest be used in restoration. And then some other recommendations that I have are just planting in buckets with soil and then use the entire bucket in restoration sites. So Xanachellia palustris and Rupia serosa, each they travel through their rhizomes, and so plants will do much better when they're growing in groups, and which would allow root buildup and free rhizome movement. So these ones wouldn't die. These ones also did really bad with pellets and didn't grow a whole lot at all. And this is a much more scalable option that would be a lot easier to rather than 1 pellet or 1 cutting for each site. Do I have any questions?
How much soil did you put in those buckets?
About 5 centimeters.
Okay.
Yeah, it kind of varies. Sometimes it's like 5 to 8 or so. But yeah, that was about
Sandy, were those wild? Were you collected those wild or were you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if any of you would like this, the locations, I have an entire map with pretty much every plant we've ever seen.
Small quantity, said that less than 4 week time, that's just your. We'll bring in the field,
Yes.
and that's from cut, like.
I would just gather the plants and then stick them into the soil and then just let it go for 2 weeks. And then you'll be good.
You might remember, one second, sorry, for those of you that have been tracking this aquatic plant project over the last few years, we've been learning a lot. We had Kate Sinnott and Megan Slocum also working on this. We had musicosms set out in Millville for propagating plants, and that turned out to not be nearly as successful and a lot of work to maintain those. And so the fact that just literally bucket propagation in greenhouses is super low tech and pretty straightforward to set up. I know Lake Wellard is about to get 40 acres for growing plants, for instance. I mean, you could get a lot of aquatic different species collected. And then Sandy and some of the folks that came before her, we have a really detailed map where a lot of different species can be collected and source materials for propagation. So this has really been about building capacity for aquatic plants, because the state in general didn't have that, right? Anyway, we're going to switch gears to talk about seeds now, and we've got Montana Horschler here, and she's wrapping up her master's project and is going to be defending shortly. So I'll turn it to Montana to talk about her project.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm a master's student in the Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab. I'll be presenting on my field-based research mostly, which is about optimizing field seeding timing for places and times when we don't know how much water we're going to have potentially. So one of my big questions was, what is the best time of year to seed for restoration? And here's are generally seeding May, June, and we wanted to see maybe there are better times of year or things that do better if they're seeded at different times of year. So we seeded once this was altered in 2024, seeded by hand at 3 times the rate that managers are generally seeding at. Once in June, once in August, once in mid-September. Yes, okay. So we seeded at two sites, one at Howard Slough and one at Farmington Bay. On the right here, you can see pictures of what the sites kind of looked like through. This was the middle of the 2025 growing season. So the top site is Howard Slough. So that was like difficult to walk through. And the bottom site is our Farmington Bay site. So that is just across the dike from the Teal Lake unit. And that site was pretty much dry through both of the growing seasons of 2024 and 2025. That's what this plot on the left-hand side of the slide are showing. So 2024 is on the top. The left-hand side is Farmington Bay, and the right-hand side is Howard Slough, and the x-axis is time. Those little red dots represent when we seeded at each site. So the black line in that plot is ground level, and then the other lines are water depth at different groundwater wells that we installed at each site. And as you can see, Farmington Bay, the groundwater was well below the surface of the soil for most of each season. And Howard Slough pretty much had standing water throughout the entire 2025 growing season and for much of the 2024 growing season. So that probably accounts for the difference. We seeded a 22 species mix at each of these 3 times. I'm not going to go through every species on here, but I just wanted to show you the diversity that we had. We had some meadow forbs, we had playa species, we had graminoids, emergent plants, we had grasses, stickless, one being one of them, Chinellia being one of them, saltgrass and Neville's alkali grass. So what are some of my results? I'm talking about the Farmington Bay site here. So on the left, that's a picture of what Farmington Bay basically looked like in 2025. You kind of see there's actually a difference in the density of the vegetation within the plot versus outside the plot. So that's something interesting I'm going to talk about. Each of these panels, we have Farmington Bay 2024 on the top and 2025 on the bottom. And each of these lines represents growth of different community types over time. So the red line is invasive plants, and the green line is seeded plants. The blue line is unseeded native plants. As you can see, the cover number got super high in either year. But I just wanted to point out something interesting. Each of these treatments, we have an unseeded control, the seeding in June, the seeding in August, and the seeding in September. And look at this, in 2025, we have this weird little green bump. I wonder what that could be. Those are, spoiler alert, our native plants established from our September 2024 seeding, which is kind of incredible given the conditions at Farmington Bay. Yeah, so switching here to Howard Slough, very different site, really different things going on. You can see our June seeding, these were the same lines. The native seeded total, which is the green line, was higher across most of both growing seasons, June 2024 and 2025 seedings. But then we also have this similar bump in the September 2024 seeding in the 2025 growing season, which is cool. But yeah, it's borne out in our data analysis that the June 2024 seeding had the higher, this is real. This is raw data, but this is borne out in the analysis. So good on you guys for seeding in June. This is water. So now I'm going to go over what grew at Farmington Bay this week. So these are species that reached above 2% of cover at any time in the growing season. And two of them are invasive species, and one of them is a seeded species. So that accounts for that little bump. The tallest line there is Fascia, also known as Kocha. And then we have a little bit of Bragg, which is that lower dark red line. And then we have this green line, which is Nuttall's alkali grass. Very cool. It grew. Yeah, all right. I didn't talk about this leftmost panel on the previous slide. It wasn't that interesting. This one is more interesting. It shows differences between the 2024 and 2025 growing season in what species established. The bluer colors on these plots are seeded species. The greener colors are native species that were just like ambiently at the site. And then the brown red colors are invasive species. So yeah, again, you can see each of these bars represents a different plot type. So plots that were seeded at different times in 2024. And over both 2024 and 2025, the June seedings had a higher diversity of native plants and a lower number of invasive plants and a lower cover of invasive plants. So this is all cover data. Yeah, just some highlights. This is a much more complex plot, these four up here, because there's just so many more species that were able to establish themselves at Howard Slough. But we had, Howard Slough was dominated by foxtail barley and cattail for a lot of the growing season, but also Chenoplectus cutis, hardstem bulrush, and only three-square bulrush did quite well in those recent species. So maybe not a surprise for everybody. Yeah, so I guess this is just kind of another way to tell you what species did well. I want to highlight again the Nuttall's alkali grass doing well in Farmington Bay. And we'll go back to this slide too, because you can see it here as well. This is the same at Howard Slough. So cool. Yeah. So of all of the species that I seeded, these ones were the highlights. Nuttall's alkali grass didn't reach like super high cover at either site, but I just want to give it a shout out for doing so well at our Farmington Bay site with such ecological challenges. And then we have our high performing meadow orb annual beggar tick did really well at Howard Slough and was able to persist into 2025 season, which was cool because it's rainy. And then I also want to point out the seaside aerograss. That one wasn't as impressive in the 2024 cover data, but by 2025 it was doing pretty well. Pretty cool plant. Yeah, my takeaways are overall, it doesn't matter when you seed, if your site has no water, you're gonna probably, which I'm surprised in, I'm sure. At sites with water, seeding in June works well and can suppress or not in the modeling data. And I just want to say it might be worth exploring fall seeding and summer reproducing non-dormant species. So if you have areas that are flooded in the spring and then go dry throughout the whole summer, like maybe something that reproduces in midsummer, like the alkali grass, or sorry, the Nuttall's alkali grass, could be something good to explore. So that grass outperformed inland saltgrass. So I know you guys are seeding a lot of inland saltgrass, but this one did quite well and it was able to set seed. I really would like to look at whether the seeds that it set were viable, and I did collect samples, so I can let you guys know if anybody's interested, but yeah. And I'd like to thank everybody that supported this project. A lot of you have dedicated time and effort over the past few years to helping set things up and giving me information and working with me on helping it happen. So thank you very much.
So your consideration for seeding or potentially seeding in the fall, you recommend that for sites that expect to go dry during the summer months. You'd seed in the fall and hope that you get your seed crop.
Or just that one species though. So it didn't work with any other of the 22 species that we tested. But if you're thinking about doing fall seeding, probably do it in an area that is clear of vegetation. So one caveat to my results is that the Howard Smith site, when we did seed later in the year, the vegetation was so thick that maybe it just totally outcompeted everything that we seeded. So, maybe you would prep and seed like you would in the spring. But
The Nuttall's alkali grass, what was the seeding rate?
I have to look that up.
Okay.
But I think it's so
It's part of a big mix.
yes, our 22 species were like proportional throughout the entire mix. So that some of them were like bigger, smaller percentages, but I can let you know. Yeah.
And I'll just add, for both Montana's project and Haley's, the outside the Teal Lake went dry. When they did seed, there was water there. And in the second spring, you also had moisture in your plot for Carmen Bay, right?
When we seeded in the spring, there was water. When we seeded in August, there was no water. And in September, I think there was like about water.
Yeah. And then the 2025 growing season, there was moisture again in the spring. So it's not like they were not bone dry for 2 years. And I just want to point that out because I was very surprised that some of these drought tolerant species couldn't establish and hang on under those conditions. And that was partly why both Montana and Haley have a much more diverse seed mix, including these meadow and playa species. They couldn't cut it. The species, not the students. Okay, and now, Haley, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you very well. Haley is in Chicago and she was conducting her research at the same time as Montana. And Haley, go for it. We can hear you very clearly.
Okay. Hello everyone. Like Karin said, I'm about to finish my master's in her lab, and I'm going to talk about my field experiment results today. And my research focuses on how we can improve the outcomes of seed-based revegetation in the context of uncertain water availability. Oops. Okay. So my specific research question looks at whether a precision restoration approach or bed hedging approaches result in more robust plant communities. So each of these boxes is a treatment in the field experiment. The first is just an unseeded control to see what's coming up in the background. And then we have a precision treatment, which is where we seed with species whose hydrologic preferences match the conditions of the site at the time of seeding. And we're just seeding once when water levels are optimal for germination. And the last three boxes are all of our bed hedging treatments. So the first is just seeding once with a diverse mix. And that's where we seeded species with a broad range of hydrologic tolerances. So like Karin just mentioned, we're thinking that regardless of what site conditions are, something in that mix is likely to establish. And the next two use that same seed mix, but they add another element of risk mitigation by varying the timing of seeding. So the delayed germination treatment only had half of the species treated to break dormancy, giving the untreated seeds the opportunity to germinate later. And then in the multi-year sowing treatment, we seeded half of the total seed mix in 2024 and then half in 2025. So this is the seed mix that you just saw from Montana. This is the one that is 22 species, and it was used in my bed hedging treatments. And then you can see we have multiple plant community types that are down here in the bottom left. And these were the 5 species that were used in the precision treatment. So these were chosen based on the site conditions at the time of seeding, and also because we know they're widely available to restoration practitioners in this region. So as Montana just covered, we had quite inadequate moisture at Farmington Bay, which led to low plant establishment. So these graphs on the left are showing the cover over time data in 2024, which is the top panel, and then 2025, which is the bottom panel. And we have 3 cover categories, so an invasive total, and then the seeded cover is in green, and unseeded native cover is in blue. And then our monitoring dates are on the x-axis, and then cover is on the y-axis. So we had really low native plant establishment over both years due to having really dry field conditions. And just to illustrate this, these are the graphs of our groundwater depth at Farmington Bay. So that black horizontal line represents the soil surface. So as you can see, we did have water above the soil surface at the time of seeding, but that really quick drawdown is likely what led to our low establishment there, as there was just a really small window for these seeds to germinate. And in 2025, our groundwater wells were actually empty for the majority of the season. So the groundwater was below 1.25 meters below the surface. At Howard Slough, we had much more promising results. These graphs are set up the previous way, or the same way as the previous slide. And so over both years, we saw a steady growth of the seeded species throughout the season. In that top bubble, you can see that the precision treatment actually surpassed the invasive cover by the end of the first growing season. But in 2025 at the bottom, 3 out of the 4 seeded treatments actually had more native cover than invasive at the end of the season. So these are the mixed effect model results of the end of season cover at Howard Slough. So our cover is on the y-axis, and then our treatments are on the x-axis. Points in red are the 2024 data, and then points in blue are 2025. So for our seeded species, these panels to the left are only the mean cover of species that were in our seed mix. The unseeded control is not included here because the seeded cover there is too low to accurately model with the seeded treatments. So in 2024, the precision treatment produced the highest cover, but in 2025, there were no differences between all of our seeded treatments. So this is telling us that in the second year, those temporally delayed treatments, the delayed germination and multi-year sowing, were able to catch up and cover to the treatments that were all germinating at the same time. And then this is the graph of our total native cover. So this includes our unseeded native species so that we can compare it to the unseeded control. And as you can see, the unseeded control had significantly lower native cover than all of the seeded treatments both years. So we did see a benefit of seeding regardless of what the treatment was. And then these results are really interesting. So these are our total invasive cover models. And so in 2024, our precision treatment most effectively suppressed invasive cover. And that is also the one that had the highest seeded cover. And those time delayed treatments were not significantly different from our unseeded control. However, in 2025, our only seeded treatment that had lower invasive cover was the multi-year sowing treatment. So it's telling us in this environment with suitable water levels, repeated seedings still are giving us a cumulative benefit, even though in total it was the exact same amount of seed going into this treatment as the other three. And the delayed germination also had additional time windows for germination. But we think since those seeds were in the field and they may have been exposed to predation or weather, we did not see the same cumulative benefits of that treatment as doing 2 targeted seeding events. So I'm also looking at the cost and time investment associated with the treatments. So these blue bars are showing us the relative time investment, and the green bar is the cost of each seed mix, and that's just the cost per pound based on several vendor invoices that we had. So these time estimates are based on our experimental process. So it includes cold stratification, seed weighing, and the installation. But since actual tasks will vary for restoration practitioners, these are just an estimate. So the precision and diverse mix treatments took about the same amount of time. So we're using those as our baseline. But the delayed germination took about 1.5 times the amount of time to implement. And that's here is accounting for the extra time we spent in separating stratified and non-stratified seed. But again, in an actual restoration scenario, these differences might not translate exactly. So multi-year sowing, as you'll recall, gave us the greatest ecological outcomes in year 2. But unsurprisingly, this method also required the greatest amount of time at 3 times our baseline due to needing an entire separate seeding event in addition to the first in the second year. So these plots are showing the mean cumulative cover of all of our species in the final week of the experiment. They're pretty busy, so I'm just going to point out our main takeaways here. Farmington Bay is the top panel, and then Farmington Bay is to the left, and then Howard Slough is to the right, and then our top panel is 2024, and the bottom panel is 2025 data. So at Farmington Bay, again, we didn't have a lot of native growth, but a few species that were able to withstand to the end of the growing season were this golden dock in our first year, which is an annual forb. And then in 2025, we had saltgrass and then this perch seepweed in our plots, and which is one of those drought tolerant species. But again, these were in very low quantities. So at Howard Slough, we saw our treatments get more diverse in the second year. In the first year, our native cover was primarily comprised of these species with additions from a few others, but the main ones that we saw that year were the beggar's tick, which is an annual forb, inland saltgrass, the golden dock, and hardstem bulrush. However, in the second year, those species were all still present, especially the beggar's tick in pretty large amounts. That's that navy blue at the top of the 3 bed hedging treatments. So you can see it made up a large amount of the cover. But we also had several species come up from our seed mix that did not appear in 2024. And those are the common spike rush, scratchgrass, and the seaside arrowgrass. And we also had a much larger quantity of the chairmaker's bulrush in 2025 than we did in 2024. So just to summarize, limited water at Farmington Bay and that small window for germination led to sparse plant establishment. And at Howard Slough, where we were not water limited, the precision treatment led to rapid establishment in 2024 and produced the most seeded cover. But in 2025, we saw evidence that sowing over multiple years was the most effective, as it had high seeded cover and the lowest invasive cover. However, this also required the greatest amount of time to implement and was using the more expensive seed mix. So our takeaways in terms of management implications are that one, if there is extreme moisture limitation, like we saw, it may warrant avoiding seeding that area because once again, even our diverse seed mix with those drought tolerant species, we're still not able to buffer against those low soil moisture conditions. In a situation where a steady supply of water is possible, taking that precision approach where you're targeting species to the site conditions could lead to rapid establishment of native plant communities. But if resources are available, spreading seeding over multiple years might lead to greater establishment by reinforcing the seed bank and providing multiple windows for germination, even if you're not in a water limited environment. And that being said, unfortunately, we were not able to test the bet hedging strategies in a truly variable hydrologic environment or in a moderate level of drought, which is where they're expected to really shine. So we still do not know how these treatments would perform in that type of scenario. And then I also would just like to mention, if you would like to learn more, my defense is coming up next month. So I'll be talking about this in more depth and then also my greenhouse experiment results. But I will take any questions.
For Haley, over
The room can actually.
or she can hear you. So you have questions for Haley? Rena.
It's kind of a combined question for both of you, because I might have missed yours, but I saw that you put invasive in your models, and I think she had hers as native. And I was just wondering, like, what the just like thinking of.
I actually, sorry, I could not hear you.
She was wondering, what we're classifying Chenopodium species as, invasive and non-native or native.
We classified those as native.
So I think yours and Montana's have different things on them.
Oh, okay. I'm pretty sure it is a native. I'm pretty sure it might be non-native but non-invasive. I'll double check.
Emily says she's seen it as both, and I've seen it also as non-native but not invasive.
I don't know. We're gonna let Karina and Montana do that over coffee because we have an excellent botanist in the room.
I'll take notes, I'll tell you that.
I don't know. Never mind. I haven't actually looked into it.
We
should probably do that.
Yeah, I think they're originally not from North America. I guess the ones that I think are likely going to bring them off. But they're not last year. Sounds like we like them.
Controversial species.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I just rather find you're like you're in shape to cover, or you're like the natural trees aren't really active, like they're not really. Yeah, it's like not at all.
Okay, any other questions for Haley while she's on Zoom? Otherwise, please tune in to her defense. In my defense. We're going to take a quick break, probably just 5 minutes. We only have 2 talks after this and then lunch. So maybe just 5 minute or less stretch, and then we'll Oh, yeah. Lauren, you are.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you guys. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Can you hear us? Yeah, we can hear you.
I can barely hear anybody in the room. It was really loud, and then all of a sudden, I can't hear anything.
So
Or maybe it's just a really muffled sound.
Yeah,
I
I
could hear
also
Ashlyn
cannot.
talking in the background at one point though. So I don't know what happened all of a sudden.
Yeah, I also cannot really hear anything anymore.
Okay. Glad it's not just me.
I don't
we're gonna mute ourselves either way because we can hear Lauren. Like theoretically be able to hear Lauren. So Lauren.
Okay. I can see you, Karin, if you just want to give me a thumbs up when you want me to start talking, maybe I'll just do it that way because I can't quite make out what y'all are saying.
We're gonna turn it over to Lauren, and I'll just mention in Haley's presentation, you noticed she talked about some of the logistical requirements of the different CD treatments, and that's really building on the work that Lauren Taylor did as part of her master's work. She defended last spring. I asked her to come and give a very rapid presentation from her thesis work for those of you that couldn't attend her defense. So, hey.
Okay. Thanks, Karin. I actually could hear you a little bit there. It's like it must be like a mic or something in that room that you all are in that's cutting in and out or something. But anyways, super happy to be here. Thanks for letting me join over Zoom. I do think it is important for us as researchers to share all of our results and findings. And given that I did do my defense in the summer, most of my managers couldn't attend. So this was just an opportunity for me to share some of those results with you all today. So thanks for allowing me to join. And I will just put a plug, like I'm going to be going over my thesis results very quickly and only giving you a small snippet of everything that I did publish. So I will encourage everyone, if you are interested in this project and hearing it in greater detail, my defense is available on the Whirl YouTube channel. And my thesis is published now and it's available online in the USU Commons. So with that, just as a reminder, I know most of the managers in the room are probably pretty familiar with my project where I studied manager perspectives and incorporating them into how we evaluate wetland revegetation strategies. So as I mentioned, oh, sorry, there we go. As I mentioned, I am going to be just kind of sweeping over all of the justification for this research and just really want to focus on the results. But I did want to remind everyone that I did have 3 primary research questions that I addressed in my project. The first one being what factors enable and constrain wetland managers' revegetation decision-making. 2, what information or resources could assist wetland managers in revegetation decision-making? And 3, how do different wetland revegetation techniques compare when they are evaluated by factors managers perceive as the most influential to revegetation decision-making? So I did accomplish this project in 2 different parts. I addressed those first 2 research questions using semi-structured interviews with wetland managers. And then I also incorporated a field experiment where I compared 3 commonly used revegetation techniques based on the important decision-making factors that came up during that interview process with managers. So for the interview portion of my study, I'm going to focus on that first. This did focus on the Great Salt Lake watershed, where all of my managers that participated in this project were in that watershed. They all had revegetation experience and they all had decision-making responsibility. And I did diversify these interview participants by employer type. And I ended up with a total of 13 interviews for this portion of my project. And then for my analysis, I did all of my interviews rather were recorded and transcribed, and then I conducted thematic analysis in Atlas TI as well as intercoder agreement in that same platform. I also calculated the theme prevalence across the board based on research question, and you will see those results on the screen now. So you can see here, this is a table that is broken up by research question with each of the themes that are associated there, and it is all weighted by theme prevalence for those research participants. So for my first research question, I had a total of 12 themes and 2 sub-themes. And then for my second research question, I had a total of 5 themes. Now, I do want to draw your attention to these first 7 key themes that came up for research question 1. These all had equal prevalence, meaning they were equally important for all of the participants in this study. So these are really important key factors that are helping managers make these revegetation decisions, and that's capacity, cost, goals and objectives, monitoring and evaluation, site conditions, managing adaptively, and governance and partnership support. We will talk about 4 of these in a little bit more detail today, but because of time constraints, I won't be able to go over all 7 of these key factors. So for that, I'll just point you to the direction of my thesis. You will get more detail in that if you take a look at it. I will also draw your attention to the 2 key decision-making resources that came up for question 2, and that was experience and peer-to-peer learning, again, coming out with equal prevalence for all managers for this study. I will say that experience in the context of my research was really personal experience that was gained through actively doing revegetation. So managers were really learning through trial and error in this revegetation process. And that really isn't a resource that we can supply to them. That's something that they gain along the way. And so for that reason, peer-to-peer learning came out as the preferred resource for guiding revegetation decision-making for my project. Now, before I move on, I just want to highlight that in an ideal setting, these 2 research questions and their associated findings should be linked to one another. And what I mean by that is that if we get into a habit of incorporating all or as many of these key factors in question 1 into the resources that we supply to managers in question 2, we will ultimately be providing a more beneficial and useful resource to these managers that can actually guide them in this decision-making process. So just want to put a plug there. All right, so this slide is just a quick little snippet of my thematic analysis process, and I really wanted to show everyone in the room how these themes are really being factored into the decision-making process for wetland managers. And so what I have here are a few quotes that kind of demonstrate that process for each of these 4 key themes of goals and objectives, cost, capacity, and site conditions. So if we look at goals and objectives here, we have a quote from a manager that says, "The technique and the way that we seed and what seed we use varies a little bit, but the end goal is the same." So the takeaway here is that managers are really considering what their end goals are for their larger restoration effort or revegetation component of that larger effort, and they're using that to help them determine which technique might help them meet those goals and objectives best. If we look at cost here, we have another quote where a manager says, "We use seed almost exclusively because of cost for installation more than plugs or other plant types." So as we all know, restoration is very expensive. Revegetation is also an expensive component of the restoration process. No matter what governance structure or employer type we might come from, there will always be some type of restoration budget that we all have to adhere to. So which proportion of that budget gets allocated towards revegetation is very variable, and each of these techniques, as we'll see later, can vary greatly in how expensive they are to implement, and this can really lead managers to selecting one technique over another, as we can see illustrated in this quote here. For capacity, I chose this quote today. This individual says, "Personnel and time necessary to manage and implement restoration projects is probably another major constraint." So for me, the takeaway is that capacity can really be the limiting factor that is setting the size and the scale of revegetation efforts. Some techniques can be more labor intensive than others, and based on the resources or the labor force that managers have available to them, this might lead them to select one technique over another. Because those techniques do vary greatly in labor requirements. Finally, we have site conditions, and I just want to note that for site conditions, that is where my two sub-themes came up on my previous slide. And those sub-themes were water and site access and equipment. So I just want to note that there because they are pretty important. And just to Montana and Haley's points that they made earlier, it doesn't really matter when you vegetate or what seed mix you use. If you don't have water at a site, it won't grow. And we can see a similar concept, and I thought it was ironic, so I just had to note that with the quote that I selected to share with you all today, where this manager says, I'm very selective with where I would do a project where I know it's going to succeed with water. We're talking about wetland plants and wetland revegetation, so that's obviously really important when managers are selecting these sites. And then as we mentioned previously, these projects are really costly, they're expensive, they take a lot of time, they take a lot of personnel. So managers are going to be really selective with their site locations where they think these revegetation efforts are going to be the most successful. So it's a really important factor for them to consider. Oh, there's my clicker. Okay. All right, and then finally, I just wanted to touch on the knowledge exchange component of my project really briefly, because to me, this is really important in how we're sharing and disclosing this information. It became very important, or very apparent rather, very early on in my project that the preferred resource for wetland managers in making these revegetation decisions was peer-to-peer learning opportunities. And as a direct result from those findings, we did host a wetland restoration field tour where we had 70% of the participants in my study register for this event. I will say we did record this entire day, and I made a bunch of videos that are also available on the World YouTube channel. So if anyone missed that, I highly encourage you to check that out and consider using more peer-to-peer learning opportunities to share information in the future. All right, let's move on to the field portion of my project. So I did evaluate different revegetation techniques based on these following criteria of percent total native plant cover, time to reach establishment thresholds, labor requirements, cost requirements, and equipment needs. These all filter back into those 4 important key factors that we touched on previously. And then for this portion of my project, this did take place at Farmington Bay Waterfowl Management Area, where we had an initial seed and plug planting effort at Site 1, shown here in yellow on the screen, and then it was followed up by a sod mat installation at Sites 2, 3, and 4. And then this is my timeline and kind of schedule of each of these events. So we did have that initial seeding and plug planting effort that took place in 2022, with the seeding in July, followed by the plug planting in September. For each of the plots that received seed, they were sown at a 3,876 pure live seed per meter squared rate. And for each of the plots that received plugs, they received 49 plugs per plot. We came back in August of 2023 and installed 90 sod mats total, distributed across those 3 different sites that you saw on that previous slide. And then these are my results for the field experiment. So I did calculate the mean total native cover for the 2024 monitoring season per technique. And I do want to draw your attention to our peak native cover percentages for each of these techniques. So with sod, it reached 46.6% total native cover before it senesced during that last monitoring date, followed by plugs, which reached 45.7% total native cover. Seed reached 34, and then the seed and plug mixture reached 31.4% total native cover. And then we also had unplanted control plots that only reached 16.5% total native cover. And then I also calculated the plant establishment time. And for the context of my study, I did define establishment as the time and days required for plots to reach specific thresholds. And I used a Kaplan-Meier risk survival analysis to calculate this data. And I will note that the 3 thresholds that you're seeing here are directly based on interviews with wetland managers. So these are real life goals that managers in this region have for revegetation and those total native cover percentages that they're trying to reach. And then I'll also note that our start date was the date that each technique was initially implemented, and then I censored each event using the last monitoring date as the experiment end. So whenever we look at this table here, we can quickly see that sod is the most rapidly establishing technique, requiring only 322 days to reach 25% total native cover, followed by plugs that require 804 days to reach that same threshold. Now, the rest of these these techniques and within these different columns did not meet those thresholds during the experiment timeline, which just means that we need longer monitoring periods to really understand what those plant establishment times are for those different techniques and in those categories. Okay, so I also calculated the labor associated with each of these different techniques. And before I move any further, I just want to note that we have a new category in our technique column, and that is large scale seeding. So a big part of my project was really trying to make sure that whatever data or resources we supplied to managers would be meaningful for them, which means we need to look beyond experimental scale seeding whenever we're making recommendations for managers, because it's really not the same. And we can see how that plays out in my next few slides with how these differ between the seed at the experiment level versus seed at the large scale. So I really wanted to make sure that seeding using the equipment that managers use and based all of the timing and labor requirements on personal communications with managers to really make this more practical for everyone in the audience today. So we can see here in our acre hours column here that seeding at the large scale is by far the least labor intensive, requiring only 3 acre hours to implement, followed by sod, which takes quite a bit more, but substantially less than the plug planting and the seed planting at the experiment scale. All right, so next I calculated cost for implementation for each of these different techniques, and we can start to see how different trade-offs come into play in these columns here, with the plug and sod mats being the most expensive in plant material cost, but then the trade-off in that tools and equipment column where they are the cheapest in that category there. And then we start to see the trade-off with seeding at the large scale coming into play, where that's the most expensive in the tools and equipment cost, but it is the cheapest in terms of plant material. I did package all of this up in a techniques trade-off table. Some of the managers in the audience have seen earlier versions of this. This table is directly informed on the data that has been published in my thesis. So this will be the one I would point everyone to down the road. And the way that you will interpret this table is really drawing your attention initially to the favorability scale that you see at the top of the screen. This is a color-coded scale that ranges from least favorable in bright red to most favorable in bright green. And that's because I really want people to focus on the color of the cells rather than the text values. Because in some columns, the same text value might be least favorable in one column, but most favorable in the other. So the color of the scales is the key takeaway here. We can see how that plays out whenever we're looking at seed. If we go across the screen here in that column, or that row rather, we can see that seed is coming in at low for native cover, very low in plant establishment, and very high in equipment needs and cost, all on that least favorable end of the scale. But the trade-off is when we look at installation labor and plant material costs, where seed is now the most favorable in that very low category. For plugs, we can see that it's coming in at low for plant establishment, very high in both installation labor and plant material cost, again on that least favorable scale, but the trade-off is in native cover, where it's moderate, and very low in equipment needs and cost, which is most favorable. Sod mats come in at very high with plant material cost, but they're performing quite favorably in all of the other categories, with native cover at moderate, a plant establishment at high, and then installation labor and equipment needs and cost both very low, which is most favorable. So what does this mean for everybody in the audience that are all managers? Well, no technique excelled in all categories, but each technique does offer advantages under certain conditions, which highlights those contextual dependencies can really sway or should sway technique selection. And by having these diversified options allows managers to select a technique based on their own individual goals and objectives while weighing the trade-offs in ecological outcome and practical constraints. So I have a few hypothetical scenarios here on the screen to kind of walk you through how this can look in practice. So if we have a manager that has access to specialized equipment, but they are limited in labor and in their budget, they might turn towards seeding. If we have another manager that needs reliable total native plant cover and they have a surplus of capacity or volunteers, but they're limited in those tools and equipment, they might turn towards plugs. And then finally, if we have a manager that has ample budget, but they have a very restricted timeline, meaning they need a rapidly establishing technique, then they should turn towards sod mats. And with that, I just want to thank everybody that participated in this project. I want to throw out a special thank you to all of the managers that participated in my interviews. I could not have done this project without you, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity. And I will take any questions if I can hear you. I will stop sharing my screen, maybe.
Go ahead, yeah. If anybody has questions for Laura, we'll them. Question. Okay, so we have Sam and then Emily. Our lunch is gonna get set up in the background. And in 4 minutes, our photographer is gonna arrive. So Sam is gonna speak. Halfway through her talk, we're gonna awkwardly interrupt her.
Okay, good to know.
Sorry about that.
I guess
yeah, I think it was really or more really can you hear it at all? Let's go.
It's right out when it. So it is. Yeah.
Yeah, Lauren, can you hear us clearly?
I can hear you a little bit.
Yes, I agree.
I'll just talk loud.
Yes. Great. Okay, so Sam Krakowski is going to present next on 3 different things we've been working on, and Sam is our lab manager here. Can you point out our text?
I was gonna, yeah. So all of our grad students in our lab are speaking today or have already spoken, but we have 5 technicians right now floating around. Ashlyn, who many of you know, has been with us for quite a while. And then Mac and Mackenzie were our full-time technicians this summer and have stayed on with us. And then Cassidy and Adeline started with us this fall. And yeah, I'm sure they would all be happy to talk to you and hear more about what you guys do. So yeah, I have 3 projects today that I'm going to talk about. I'll circle back on that Phragmites Seed Bank longevity study that Keith mentioned that finished this year. And then Forestry Fire State Lands did a seeding at Utah Lake, which Keith also mentioned, and we did some monitoring for that a couple of months afterwards. So I'll talk about that. And then I conducted a greenhouse experiment on some drought tolerant species in January, and I'll briefly give you the. So yeah, first off is the Phragmites seed bank. It started in 2019 with a previous grad student, and they buried a whole bunch of small packets of Phragmites seeds at Farmington Bay in 3 different moisture amounts. Basically, there was a dry one, which was almost completely dry all the time, a moist one, which kind of went back and forth between drier and wetter, and then a wet one that had a few inches of standing water all the time near a culvert. And we collected these seeds every approximately a year for 5 years. And we grew them out in the growth chamber for 3 weeks to see how many of those seeds were still germinating and viable. And the good news is after 5 years, we're really pretty much at 0. So our average viability is like 1% now. But what I think is fun is that the majority of the seeds are non-viable after 3 years, which is the standard herbicide timeline that you guys are on. So that is working out, especially with the moist treatment, or not treatment, but moist buried seeds, where it's like kind of fluctuating. We were really at 0 seed germination at 3 years, whereas the wet and the dry hung on a little bit longer. And I think it's just because the moist one is kind of prompting those seeds to use their resources more to try and germinate earlier, whereas the wet and dry like kind of preserve the seeds a little bit better. So yeah. Oh, and I should mention the viability of the seeds to start is that dotted line in the graph. And then on the y-axis, we have germination proportion, or like seeds germinated. And then the x-axis is all the years over time that we collected seeds. So yeah, that's really exciting to finish that up.
And we're going to pause right there.
Great.
Brittany, if you don't mind sitting down and take a seat. Multi-talented Mike Taylor has arrived. If you want. That's all right. Yeah, just do this. All right, everybody take a look at Mike. Okay, now, rapidly, when you stand up, and we're gonna go in the back, and he's gonna take one close group photo. You wanna take it under the picture?
And I'm gonna stand between you.
Down in the back, other people that don't. They modeling.
Front center. Front center.
Well, we just got back from North Dakota.
Like that. Natural. Want to do the. Do that.
You should tell them.
The edge of that door is the farthest we're gonna go. So we're on this side of the doorway. The doorway's okay.
Here.
Yeah.
Back to him.
So next I'm gonna talk about some monitoring we did for that state land seeding. And the spoiler alert is that it went really well. There was high and diverse native plant cover after a couple months. And very little invasive species. So more about what they did. The site was disked and then seeded the next day in mid-July. With a seed mix of 40 species, so a really diverse seed mix, and 25 of those were field stratified. And on the bottom of this slide, you can see the different sections that were seeded. So everything in bright blue was a seeded area. And I kind of chunked those up into different areas just to make it a little bit easier to talk about. And we monitored these sites 2 months later, mid-September, in 1 meter quadrats, approximately every 50 meters. Since such a narrow part of the shoreline was exposed for seeding, so it was really skinny. So we just walked along the shoreline basically. Yeah. And the highlight is mostly we're seeing native plant cover, which is really cool. We had about 50% native plant cover, and invasive cover was only 1.3%. Non-native is like about 16%, I think. But yeah, even when just the narrow strip was seeded, there was pretty good native plant cover, particularly from the seed mix. There were species that we aren't seeing come up from the seed bank. I think there is a lot of things coming up from the seed bank as well, which Emily did a seed bank greenhouse study, which is kind of one reason I think that. She's not talking about that today, but that will come eventually. And then also outside of the seeded area, the shoreline had receded more, and even where it wasn't seeded, native plants were coming up. So we're getting a boost from that, but there were some unique species that we are not seeing otherwise that I know came up from the seeding. And yeah, even where it is sparse a little bit more, native plants are still making up the majority of plant cover. So in this graph here, native plant cover is blue, and then non-native is orange, invasive is red, and the bars are just mean percent cover. And then bare ground and rack, I also kept track of. But yeah, so that is cool. And then to get into what species we saw a little bit more, we saw 42 total species with 26 with more than 3% cover that are graphed here. And all of the species in blue are our native species, and the non-native species are in the warmer colors. And similar to the other one, the width of the bar is how much cover of each species we're seeing, and then each bar column is one of those areas that I was talking about from the map. And yeah, to highlight the species we saw the most, we saw 2 Cyperus and 2 Biden species most abundantly throughout the native species. And I think partly Biden's comes up really well and is like a largely forb, so that's taking up a lot of space in some places. And the Cyperus is also doing really well and forming like mats. So that was fun to see. And in the non-native species, the most common ones we had were Chenopodium and Typha. And Chenopodium felt the most common to me while I was out there. There was also burdock or arctium was a common one, but those 2 I think are of lower concern. The Typha was only in a few kind of select wetter spots, but it was really crowding out other stuff. So I think that's something to keep an eye out. And the great news, similar to what Keith was saying, we're seeing very little Phragmites. There's only 4 sightings of Phragmites in the whole place that I monitored, and it was really low cover. I think outside of our plots, there was a couple patches, but they were only like 5-10 meters square. So really low Phragmites cover overall. Last, I'll talk about this greenhouse experiment that I worked on. And so this is really what that actually looks like. We have buckets in the greenhouse that are like one replicate of our treatments, and each bucket has its own treatment of, I had hydrologic and salinity treatments, and then we grew the same seed mix in all of the buckets. So I had 11 species that are more drought tolerant playa species that were part of my seed mix, and we wanted to know how those species would do under these different conditions. So yeah, each bucket had one of these, a combination of a hydrologic and a salinity treatment. And I had 5 hydrologic treatments, all of which had 4 weeks of moist soil, so like 2 centimeters below the soil surface, so that the seeds could get established and through the vulnerable seedling stage. And then we started either adding water to flood them or stop adding water, which was how we were doing the drought treatments. So severe drought got no water for 4 weeks. And then moderate was 3 weeks of no water, and mild drought was 2 weeks of no water. And the flooded had 2 centimeters of soil water on top of the soil. And salinity treatments, we were really trying to hit the whole range that they might experience and have like discrete different treatments. So we had fresh water where no salinity was added, low salinity, which is 5 to 8 decisiemens a meter, and high salinity, which is about twice that. The biggest thing that I took away from this experiment was that our plant communities were really allowing along the salinity gradient and were really strongly influenced by salinity. So even though we seeded the exact same mix in all of these are the different, this is what each one pretty much looked like. Our fresh salinity was mainly this Nettles alkali grass, Puccinellia italiana, and that was really the dominant plant. And then in our low salinity mix, we had first seepweed or Sueda calceoliformis was most dominant, but we had some pickleweed and some Nettles alkali grass still. And then by the time we got to high salinity, we had a lot more sparse cover, and then pickleweed was the most dominant, and first seepweed was kind of co-dominant with it. So really strongly aligned along those, which is pretty interesting. And I do think partly it's just it's mostly where they compete best. So we still saw all these species pretty much in each bucket, but which ones were dominant and really making the most of the plant cover depended on the salinity treatment. Yeah, and over the whole experiment, of the 11 species, these ones made up almost all of the cover by the end. Although at the beginning, we did have more of the species established still. This is just total cover, and I'll do this quick because it's unsurprising, but shocker, when you drought the buckets, cover goes down. So that was most apparent in our fresh salinity treatment, which each box is the hydrologic treatment and each line is our salinity treatment. And the grayed out part is when the hydrologic treatment was applied. Although it's kind of hard to see in this. And yeah, the y-axis is total percent cover and the x-axis is over time. And so after about 2 weeks for each treatment, for each of the drought treatments, we saw a sharp decline in plant cover, but we didn't really get to learn very much about how drought and salinity were going together. So the fresh treatment, you can see the solid black line, it's declining, but the other ones are low salinity, the dashed line declines a little bit less, and then the high salinity, which is the dotted line, has no difference among them, and that's because the high salinity bucket never got dry. We didn't have water for a month, and it just stayed wet. I think just there wasn't as much plant material in those buckets because it's just was more sparse, and then I think those plants transpire water slower, which makes sense for how they're adapted to playa conditions. So we didn't really get to learn how those playa species respond to drought, which I'm like a little bit disappointed about, but I still think we got stuff out. And overall, I'll just briefly, these are kind of the species that saw grouping a little bit more along this salinity gradient. And each of them kind of had a moisture range that they were able to tolerate as well. So the low salinity ones were nettles, alkali grass, obviously saltgrass did better a little bit in the lower salinity treatment. And then sea milkwort, greasewood, and seaside arrowgrass. All of these, none of them were like particularly statistically significant. So it's more of an observation than kind of like strong results, but I think it's something. And then in the high salinity treatment, pickleweed was obviously the dominant species, and we had a little bit more cover of Utah swamp fire. Seaweed liked, I guess, that medium salinity and iodine bush as well. Yeah, I don't know. The three dominant ones were really the most meaningful data. So the other species is more just anecdotal. And then we finally got our dormancy seed breaking guide published. So that is now available and has recommendations for how to break dormancy for 41 of the species we commonly work with. And it has raw data from our experiments, so you can see some of the nuances, but we also show how much success you would have in breaking dormancy for each of these. And that's all I have today. So thank you.
Sam, your salinity bins that you showed, that was across all of those different water regimes too. So you saw the same species.
Yeah. Yep.
Or the same.
So I should have had a picture. The fresh salinity ones got really crispy and like died, especially with the more severe drought treatments. But they still had the same species composition. So they were able to like make it there in 4 weeks. Yeah.
I had a question about the Utah Lake Phragmites, why we're seeing so much left. Is it because there's more competition when there's more native species are able to be successful due to the salinity? Do you think salinity is a factor at Utah Lake?
Oh, why is there so little Phragmites?
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it. There's so many more species together.
I think the biggest thing is just that we're able to treat the entire firm. And have.
Okay. Thanks.
One comment just about Dan's project and planning the Haley, Montana's. We are part of what our research group is trying to help uncover is what do we do in these low water situations. So we obviously see that we're having big challenges, such as Montana and Haley experienced at those drier sites outside of the Teal Lake unit. But that's a pretty common scenario where people might be wanting to revegetate. And that's why we've been focused on these meadow and playa species, including that greenhouse experiment that Sam was looking at. So part of this is all building capacity on that drier, saltier end of things in terms of wetland restoration. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, speaking of challenging vegetation conditions. So Emily's our last speaker. Emily is a PhD student in my lab. Been here a little over a year and 2 months, and have an interesting project on Utah Lake, particularly in Forestry Fire State Land. So I'll turn it over to Emily.
Okay, thanks everyone. My name is Emily Santos. I'm a PhD student, and today I'm going to talk to you about a restoration effort we have in collaboration with Forestry Fire and State Lands on the North Shore of Utah Lake. So this is an EPA-funded project that's ongoing for 4 years, and we're about so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done so far and our investments for this project, and finally where we're headed in the end. Oh, darn. Okay. So as many of you know through your work, the way that water is moving through our landscapes has changed dramatically. And out here in the West, we're used to dealing with variability, but upstream infrastructure is really affecting what comes downstream. And this is layered on top of climate change, where we're seeing more intense droughts, more frequent flooding, and just greater unpredictability overall. And so this is definitely the case at Utah Lake, where we see major swings in water level within and across years. And this is all shaped by past water management, and it's now amplified by the climate extremes we're seeing in the state. So a lot of you folks are probably familiar with Utah Lake, but if you haven't been there, this is the type of water availability shifts that we're seeing on the North Shore. So the top photos are taken in April this year, and the bottom in September. So you can really see the lake level fluctuates quite a bit. This is what we might expect like within a year, and it's also the timing works out. This is when we would do our restoration work, so this is what we might expect to see across our drones. So yeah, native plants, as we know, have evolved under predictable variable hydrology, but it's this real big up and down swing of hydrologic extremes, which are causing seedlings to be more vulnerable. Our seeding efforts are more variable, as we can see from our different projects. And then in the case of passive repollinization, so waiting for the native vegetation to reestablish on its own after bread manure treatment, this doesn't always work when you're dealing with this level of hydrologic variability. So what do we do? How do we adapt to these conditions? And that's kind of the core behind the Utah Lake Wetland Restoration Demonstration Project. So as I mentioned, EPA funded 4 years with Forestry Fire and State Lands, and we're testing both passive and active revegetation under extreme water conditions up on the North Shore of Utah Lake. So we break this down into 3 main goals. The first is to assess seed bank viability. The second is to monitor natural recolonization, so that's that passive restoration. And the third is to evaluate seeding strategies, which I'll talk a little bit more about each of these as I go on. Okay, so the first, what's in the seed bank and is it viable? So what's in the seed bank, or the seeds that are already in the soil, are often our first kind of hope in passive restoration. If we have a really robust native seed bank, then we probably don't have to do much more, but we just don't know. So the first step of this project was to collect a bunch of soil samples from the North Shore and look at seed viability and seed bank richness. So this past April, our group took soil from a bunch of transects perpendicular to the water shoreline of North Shore. And we took samples that were on the shoreline, but also submerged samples in areas that would eventually be exposed as the seeding went on and the lake level grew down. If you're not familiar with the seed bank experiment, it's pretty simple. We brought these soils back to the greenhouse and we spread a very thin homogenized layer of the soil on top of a potted potted plant mixture in greenhouse conditions. That's what you're seeing here. And we grew that out. And once a plant was able to be identified, we pulled that out so we could allow all the seeds in the seed bank to germinate over the course of a 6-month period. And this is kind of an example of what typical day in the greenhouse would look like. Lots of the techs got experience pulling things out and IDing, and I did as well. We just finished up this experiment at the end of October, and this baseline, so just like what's in the seed bank at Utah Lake, showed a lot of species diversity. Many native species were present, some non-natives, but importantly, there was no Phragmites, so this is great. And it kind of reflects what we've seen in previous slides or previous presentations about Utah Lake, and also the viability of Phragmites in this lake. Okay, so there's another part of this seed bank question, and it's kind of we want to also understand how resilient the seed bank is. And so to do this, we also collected soil samples at the same time as this baseline experiment. And right now they're here at USU undergoing these resilience treatments. And that's 2 years of flooding, 2 years of drying, and 2 years alternating 6-month dry, 6-month wet. So these are 3 different separate treatments. And what we're doing here is really trying to characterize those swings in water level within and across years. And in 2027, we'll take these guys out of our storage and we'll germinate them to understand how resilient seed bank is to these extreme conditions at Utah Lake. Species might continue to be viable in the seed bank in the future. Okay, moving on to our second question or second goal, that's that passive restoration approach. What happens if we let nature take its course? So for this, we're monitoring unseeded plots for species cover on the North Shore, and we're using the quadrat method, monitoring once a year for the next 3 years. Here we're looking at how long does it take for natives to return? How does water availability shape which species establish and when? And then of course we're interested in comparing what we're seeing in the field and also what we're seeing in the seed bank. So this is kind of like a snapshot of our first year. The species in red, of course, are invasive species of concern, Phragmites and Tamaris. So it's seeing that on the shore of Utah Lake, but not in the seed bank. It'll be interesting to see how these, like how this data compares when we look at the resilience treatments and then also the passive recolonization over the next couple of years. But ultimately, this is supposed to help us understand when passive restoration is enough or when we need to step in and seed and give it a little bit more effort. Which leads to the last objective, which is our seeding experiment that both Keith and Sam had kind of mentioned. So in addition to what Forestry, Fire, and State Lands was doing with the broadcast seeder, we also set up a replicated, randomized and replicated hand-seeded seeding experiment where we looked at high diversity, low diversity, high and low diversity mixes, and then compared that to a control unseeded plot. So we established this in 3 different sites across the North Shore of Utah Lake. And each of these squares is a 1/10 acre plot that was hand-seeded at the same rate as the broadcast seeder. So we did this to maximize our statistical comparison of vegetation cover. And again, these are going to be monitored over the next 3 years to see what comes up. One of the questions that this is going to answer, hopefully, is does seeding lead to more diverse or stable communities? And these are the 2 mixes we were using. So I mentioned in that previous slide, a low diversity mix that's mostly composed of workhorse species. Species we're commonly using in restoration, plus some other species that have performed well in our experiments in the lab. And then the high diversity mix is all of those low diversity species plus a handful of other species that were selected for the environmental conditions at Utah Lake, including quite a bit of pollinators. These were collected, sourced locally with Great Basin and Sterling Sea. Okay, so really quick, easy results from the first year of monitoring. We did see that high diversity seed mix had higher native cover and lower bare ground cover when compared to our control plots. So those again were the no seeded plots that are representative of what would happen with just passive restoration. That's what these green triangles indicate. These quadrants below are examples of those types of plots. Another nice photo over here is showing seeding in July, and then by September, this is what it is. So we saw in the high diversity plots, a lot of bidens, the cypress species that Sam mentioned, pea plants, paintbrush, sunflower. You could definitely see like those 1/10 acre plots when you're out there just by looking and see what plots. So this is really cool, but it is the first year of data. So we'll keep collecting data and give you updates, but this alone is a clear signal that adding species diversity pays off in the first year, especially when we're thinking about that bare ground cover that could be colonized by Phragmites. There is still Phragmites on the north shore of Utah Lake, and as you guys know, the seeds are prolific, so even if they're not seed bank, you have to stay diligent. Like Haley and Lauren, we're tracking the cost and logistics of this project, so I won't get too much into this, but this is an example of what we've tracked so far. These types of materials we hope to be available to everyone by the end of the project. And speaking about deliverables, this is our timeline. So we're in 2025. We still have two more years to go. We have that second year of vegetation monitoring and the third year, as well as the resilient seed bank studies, which will happen in 2027. And then we hope to deliver by the end of this project, seeding guidance for extreme hydrology, a cost benefit trade-off that's weighing the ecological benefits versus the cost and effort of this project, practitioner training materials, and of course the detailed seed bank resilience report. So if I can leave you guys with anything, it's that this project is really developed to create practical tools for shared challenges in the Intermountain West. So lessons we learn at Utah Lake will hopefully be applicable to anywhere that we have variable hydrology, budget constraints, and we're trying to do restoration work. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone and hopefully dismiss us for lunch. But yeah, thank you. A big shout out to all the collaborators and talent in Arlo who are in the room. So thank you.
Okay, we're almost there. Give me 1 minute. Do one thing. I didn't do a presentation because I know that you will not want to look at any more slides, but I would like you to also know that we published a revised version of our Phragmites management guidance, and Chad and Keith and Christine Rohal were on this, so it's up on our USU Wetland Extension page. Read run them up. We have to remember our best titles yet, but thank you all for coming today. It's really inspiring to see what everybody has accomplished, and also to just see the benefit of these collaborations, the willingness of everybody to come and share and work together. And I think we can't do what we want to do without your support too. So I also just want to say thanks to all of you that have helped support our research program, help with classes, my classes as well. And these collaborations really allow us to do research that is more useful, practical, and also at larger scale, which is part of that too. Doing experiments in small areas doesn't necessarily inform management restoration. So the more that we can do bigger experiments, it requires a lot of time and effort, and sometimes a real pain in the neck. Anyway, really important for our work. Also, for those of you that are working with our students, you're helping in the next generation of biologists and land managers and restoration practitioners. So we do appreciate that time investment in the students in my lab. And a number of you also are involved in funding our research. So thank you very much for your financial support. Funding situation on our side of things, it's gotten much more difficult. And so all the funding we have right now is just even more valuable, and it's just getting harder and harder. So what's next for us? You have probably noticed that I didn't have any new students present new projects. I do not have new students starting this fall. We're going to take a little bit of a break here in terms of starting new projects, and we just have a lot to synthesize and share with people. And so that's going to be really the focus of our efforts over the next year or so. In addition to keeping the Utah Lakes project, there's a lot going on down there. And I also we've really, as you probably noticed, been switching to focusing as much on ecological outcomes as those logistical and cost components. And so that's going to be part of our efforts to try to bring things together, share, all these different ways to do what we've found. So with that, we have lunch in the back. We can eat here and maybe, sit in different configurations, whatever you see fit. And thanks again for coming.